People died in Henry VIII's court without anyone daring to raise their voice. Every smile hid a struggle. Every whisper carried a threat. And every gesture could end a life before sunrise. Power moved in silence, slipping between queens, ministers, and children who never understood how close danger stood. Tonight, you will walk through those quiet corridors and feel the rivalries that killed without sound. So, before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, leave a little comment letting me know what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights. Adjust the pillow to fit your head. Maybe turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere. And let's begin this journey together tonight. If one stood inside the palace corridors of Henry VIII's court, the first impression would have been silence rather than safety. The halls looked polished. The tapestries hung straight. And the courtiers moved with careful grace, as if every step had been rehearsed. They spoke softly, smiled politely, and kept their hands still at their sides. To an outsider, it might have seemed like a place ruled by order and dignity. But beneath those gestures was a tension that did not need to be voiced. Every look lasted a fraction too long. Every nod carried the weight of someone measuring advantage or danger. People learned quickly that nothing in this place was as calm as it appeared. The court was filled with men and women who understood that survival depended on perception, not merit. Their clothes were bright, their manners polished, but their eyes remained alert in the same quiet way. Animals stay cautious in a field where traps have been set. A compliment could be genuine, or it could be a step towards something darker. No one could know. Smiles were exchanged as easily as coins at the market. Yet none of them were free. Each one demanded something, whether it was trust, obedience, or silence. Those who served the king knew that his moods changed like the weather. A joke that pleased him in the morning could anger him by evening. A suggestion praised today could be condemned tomorrow. This instability made people cautious in a way that shaped their breathing and their posture. They did not raise their voices. They did not draw attention to themselves. Even the sound of footsteps seemed quieter than in other places, as if the stones themselves understood the danger of echoing too loudly. There were moments when the quiet became heavier, especially when the king's favourites walked by. People bowed deeper, moved aside quicker, and kept their faces blank. No one wished to be seen admiring or resenting the wrong person. Favour in this court did not last long. It could lift someone to extraordinary influence, but it could vanish without warning, leaving the person exposed. Others watched these rises and falls with a mixture of fear and calculation. They learned from each downfall. Studying it like a lesson, no one dared to admit they were learning. Several courtiers carried themselves with stiff precision, aware that even the way they held a cup or touched a sleeve could be interpreted as allegiance to one faction or another. Words were more dangerous still. A casual remark could be repeated, reshaped, or distorted into an accusation. The safest path was to speak little and reveal nothing. People who talked freely rarely lasted long in this environment. Their absence was seldom discussed. Their rooms were reassigned without ceremony, and their names faded quickly from conversation. Behind the polished doors, small conversations took place in corners where the candlelight was dim. These were not loud exchanges, but quiet exchanges of information. Fragments of rumour, or subtle warnings. A gesture as small as leaning closer to someone could alter the balance of power. Someone noticing that gesture could alter it again. No one needed to raise a weapon. The competition was fought with glances, inclinations of the head, and carefully timed silences. It was a kind of warfare that left no visible wounds. Yet the damage was real and lasting. At banquets, people arranged themselves with attention to who sat where. Being placed near the king suggested influence. Being moved farther away suggested trouble. Even the servants sensed the changes and adjusted their behaviour accordingly. They poured wine with steadier hands for some guests, and with visible hesitation for others. The entire room responded to shifts in royal favour, the way a forest responds to a change in wind direction. Quietly, but unmistakably, some individuals believed they could navigate this landscape with grace. They wore confidence like another layer of clothing. Yet even they learned that charm was fragile here. One wrong expression or one misunderstood action could undo years of careful positioning. Watching someone fall from favour left an imprint on the others. It taught them that no one was immune, no matter their background or accomplishments. The court did not discriminate by skill or loyalty, it simply moved on, leaving the fallen behind. For those who were new to this world, the most confusing aspect was how calm everything appeared. There were no raised voices, no blatant confrontations. The danger was quiet, as if the walls themselves absorbed every whisper. A person could stand in the centre of the great hall and see nothing unusual, yet still feel a faint pressure in the air. The pressure of people watching each other, pretending not to. This pretense was the foundation of the court. Without it, the structure would collapse under the weight of its own rivalries. It was common for courtiers to leave gatherings with a sense of unease, wondering whether their gestures had been interpreted correctly or whether someone had noticed a hesitation they had not meant to reveal. They reviewed each interaction privately, trying to identify what might have been misinterpreted. It created a quiet dread that became a constant part of their existence. They carried it with them from morning until night. Yet they never spoke of it. Silence was safer than admitting fear. Even those close to the king were not exempt from this environment. Their proximity to power made them targets for jealousy and suspicion. People watched them closely for any sign of weakness, a poorly timed reaction, a misplaced word, or an unnoticed expression could invite scrutiny. They learned to maintain a mask, one that did not crack even under pressure. Whether they laughed or frowned, it had to be controlled. Authentic emotion was too risky. Some who survived the longest did so by blending into the background. They avoided bold gestures, loud clothing, or memorable statements. They remained polite, but not engaging, visible, but not noticeable. These individuals understood that the court rewarded stillness more than brilliance. They let others fight for attention and opportunities, knowing that those battles often ended in quiet ruin. They were not admired, but they endured. And endurance in this court was more valuable than admiration. Others attempted to form alliances. Though these alliances were fragile, trust was limited, and the fear of betrayal hovered constantly between people. A whispered agreement could be forgotten the moment it became inconvenient. Every person calculates risks daily, measuring what they stand to gain against what they might lose. It was a constant mental exercise, exhausting yet necessary. The most striking part of this world was how ordinary it all seemed to those living within it. They had grown accustomed to the quiet dangers, the careful words, and the polished smiles. They accepted it as the natural order of things. Only someone standing at the edge of the hall, watching the slow exchange of glances and gestures, would understand how much hostility could hide inside such graceful movements. The calm surface of this place revealed how easily danger could hide behind polite gestures. The quiet movements within the court prepared the ground for deeper tensions. And something was waiting behind those controlled smiles. Something no one wished to name aloud. The presence of Henry VIII shaped the atmosphere of the court in a way that no rulebook could fully explain. His authority did not rest only on laws or tradition, but on the unpredictable rhythm of his moods. People adjusted themselves around him with a precision that came from fear rather than admiration. They watched his face when he entered a room, noting the angle of his jaw or the speed of his steps, because these details often mattered more than any decree. A single expression could change the course of someone's life, and everyone understood this without being told. The king's temper could shift without warning. He could be generous in the early hours, distributing praise and granting requests, then grow cold by midday for reasons he never explained. Those who had received favour that morning walked more carefully in the afternoon, worried that the memory of the king's goodwill might not last long enough to protect them. Even his closest advisers learned to speak slowly, choosing every word as if it might be held against them later. People in his circle lived with a constant calculation. They weighed the risk of pleasing him against the risk of displeasing someone else he might value more. His affection could lift families into high status, offering them land, titles, or influence. But once he turned against them, that same affection became evidence used to destroy them. The sudden shift from favour to suspicion was so common that courtiers rarely reacted with surprise anymore. What unsettled them was how ordinary these reversals became. Servants, musicians, and attendants felt the changes as well. When Henry entered a hall in a dark mood, the entire space seemed to adjust itself. Conversations softened, movements slowed, and even the sound of clothing brushing against the floor grew quieter. People understood instinctively that drawing attention to themselves could be dangerous. Even those with no political involvement kept their heads low, knowing that being noticed at the wrong moment could invite the king's frustration. There were times when Henry's enthusiasm for a person or an idea became overwhelming. He could speak with warmth, offering promises and affection, creating the impression that someone had secured a stable place in his world. But these moments were temporary. The same intensity that fueled his admiration also fueled his anger. When he felt betrayed or disappointed, the reaction was immediate and severe. It was not uncommon for someone to fall from his grace within hours, their position erased as if it had never existed. Families connected to the court worried constantly. A single disagreement with the king could undo generations of advancement. A poorly timed remark or an unfortunate association could leave an entire lineage vulnerable. Some families tried to distance themselves from court affairs, but distance often looked like disloyalty. Remaining too close, however, made them targets for others who wished to replace them. There was no safe position, only temporary stability. Henry's decisions affected the entire structure of government. His personal relationships influenced policies more than any legal principle. When he favoured a minister, that minister reshaped the kingdom. When he discarded one, the kingdom had to shift again. People adapted to each new direction with careful obedience, masking any confusion or frustration. They understood that questioning him directly, even politely, was interpreted as defiance. The king's emotional life extended into every corner of the palace. It determined who married whom, which alliances remained intact, and which reputations were damaged beyond repair. His preferences dictated who advanced academically, militarily, or socially. Even religious positions rose and fell according to his changing priorities. Those who served him learned that consistency did not exist. Their survival depended on reading the environment and anticipating his reactions before he expressed them. Some courtiers tried to present themselves as steady and reliable, hoping to appear useful regardless of the king's mood. But reliability was not always rewarded. Henry was drawn to novelty and intensity. Those who seemed too calm or independent risked being overlooked or mistrusted. This tension pushed people to behave in ways that felt unnatural, shaping their posture, their conversations, and even their expressions. It became clear to many that the king's power was not merely political, but psychological. His unpredictability created a climate where caution replaced sincerity. People did not speak their true thoughts, and they rarely allowed themselves to feel secure. Every gesture, every pause, every moment of hesitation became part of a larger calculation. Those who lived closest to him understood that they were never interacting with a stable figure. They were navigating the shifting ground of a man whose emotions could redraw their lives in an instant. The impact of this reached beyond those who worked directly with him. Families far from court felt the consequences of decisions made out of anger, fear, affection, or impulse. Titles changed hands. Lands were confiscated, and privileges vanished. The king's choices travelled outward like quiet waves, touching everyone, whether they wished for involvement or not. In time, people stopped asking why certain events happened. They learned that reasoning was irrelevant when the central force in their world did not operate from logic. Adaptation became the only strategy. The court functioned, but it functioned through restraint, anxiety, and constant observation. Every person moved within these boundaries, knowing that stability rested entirely on a man whose heart shifted without warning. His presence shaped the court in ways that left no space for steady ground. The movements around him hinted at further tensions waiting beneath the surface. And somewhere in that shifting landscape, a quiet force prepared to alter everything again. The structure of Henry VIII's court created an environment where every space, no matter how ordinary it appeared, carried the weight of political intention. The Queen's chambers, the council rooms, the gardens, and even the private chapels were not places of rest or reflection. They were quiet fields where silent moves were made, each one intended to shift influence from one direction to another. People who walked these corridors understood that nothing in the palace existed without consequence. The queens themselves lived under pressures that went far beyond the expectations of marriage. Their role extended into matters of inheritance, foreign alliances, and religious policy. Each gesture they made, each visitor they received, and each conversation overheard by a servant contributed to how the court interpreted their position. To be queen was to hold a title that appeared powerful but carried constant risk. Their influence depended not only on the king's approval, but on how others used them as symbols or tools in their own ambitions. Behind these women stood families eager to advance their status. A queen's success meant prosperity for those connected to her. Her failure meant disgrace that spread outward like a stain. This pressure shaped the atmosphere around them. Some walked with guarded composure, aware that every action could be recorded, repeated, or twisted. Others attempted to gain control over the spaces around them, surrounding themselves with loyal attendants or removing individuals whose presence seemed threatening. Yet control was always fragile. Someone else was always waiting to step closer when an opportunity appeared. The king's advisors operated with similar caution. They spoke to him as if each syllable had been weighed before reaching their lips. Their loyalty was constantly scrutinized, not only by the king but by rivals who watched for signs of hesitation or weakness. An advisor might spend his days drafting policies and his evenings navigating subtle traps set by other men who sought his position. The titles they held did not shield them. Power attracted attention, and attention brought danger. Even minor officials or household officers found themselves involved in these struggles. A seemingly simple decision, such as arranging seating at a feast or granting a request for an audience, could elevate one person or diminish another. These actions were noted carefully. Someone denied a privilege might respond with rumors, alliance, or quiet retaliation. In a place where no one admitted their intentions openly, resentment accumulated in silence. Servants became unintentional participants in these battles. Their presence in private rooms meant they witnessed discussions others tried to hide. Some learned to keep their eyes lowered and their tongues still, hoping to remain invisible. Others realized that information was its own currency. A whisper offered at the right moment could earn them protection from a powerful figure. The boundary between service and influence blurred easily, especially when secrets circulated freely through the palace. Meals, ceremonies, and daily routines carried an undercurrent of tension. At the long tables of the great hall, the placement of each person indicated shifting hierarchies. Courtiers monitored these arrangements, noting who had moved closer to the king or who had been quietly pushed farther away. A single adjustment could change how people interacted with one another for weeks. The simplest events became maps of rising and falling favor. Even the chapel, a place expected to offer stability, could not escape the reach of political movement. People watched where others knelt, who lingered after prayers, and which attendants accompanied them. Religious devotion and political allegiance were often interpreted as the same thing. A glance during a hymn or hesitation before entering the pews could be used to imply suspicion or ambition. No ritual remained untouched by interpretation. For those who hoped to remain safe, avoiding conflict was nearly impossible. Their lives overlapped constantly with the strategies of others. They shared hallways, meals, and ceremonies with individuals who viewed them as obstacles or potential allies. The court's design, with its narrow staircases and interconnected rooms, forced these encounters. People learned to control their expressions, maintain steady voices, and avoid showing discomfort. A slight shift in tone or posture could reveal more than intended. Some individuals attempted to move through this environment with patience, believing that staying neutral would protect them. But neutrality itself could be judged suspicious. Others saw it as hesitation or concealed ambition. Remaining unnoticed required more skill than rising in ranks. It demanded restraint in every action, as well as an understanding of how others might interpret even the smallest gesture. The most revealing aspect of this space was how rarely conflicts erupted openly. Hostility moved quietly, carried in the way someone stepped aside to avoid another, or the precise moment a conversation ended when a third person entered the room. These signals were subtle enough to escape an outsider's attention, but clear enough for anyone who lived within the palace. They formed a language of their own, one built from caution, anticipation, and unspoken warning. This constant vigilance shaped the behavior of everyone involved. They learned that alliances shifted without announcement, and that a person's status could change between sunrise and sunset. Their environment demanded endurance rather than confidence. They were not competing through open confrontation, but through habits of observation and restraint that determined who advanced and who vanished from the king's presence. Each movement within these rooms showed how influence shifted without making a sound. The stillness that surrounded these interactions prepared the way for new tensions to form. There was something hidden in those quiet exchanges, something waiting to unsettle the court once more. An unguarded glance in Henry VIII's court carried consequences far beyond what most people would imagine. Faces were carefully arranged, eyes lowered at the proper moment, and every expression controlled with the precision of someone stepping across thin ice. A look held too long, or delivered at the wrong time, could be interpreted as defiance, doubt, or hidden allegiance. Courtiers learned to manage their gaze the way others managed their weapons, aware that a single misstep could be the beginning of their downfall. People moved through corridors with steady eyes, avoiding sudden turns or moments of hesitation. They watched each other without appearing to watch, understanding that attention itself could be dangerous. A glance exchanged between two individuals might suggest a secret agreement. A brief look of concern might be twisted into suspicion. Even the king noticed these moments, and his interpretation mattered more than the truth. Those standing near him became skilled at controlling their expressions, knowing that he studied faces as closely as he studied actions. Messengers who carried unpleasant news walked with apprehension. They knew that the content of their words was not what made them vulnerable. It was the reaction written on the king's face when he received their message. If his anger rose quickly, they became its first target. Some tried to soften their tone. Others shortened what they said. But none of these efforts guaranteed safety. The king's frustration did not always distinguish between the cause of the problem and the person who delivered it. Silence offered limited protection. People learned to speak only when directly addressed. And even then, to use the simplest words possible, too much eagerness could imply ambition. Too much caution could imply guilt. Remaining quiet allowed them to fade into the background. But silence also created opportunities for others to accuse them of withholding information. It became a delicate balance between saying too much and saying too little. And no one knew which danger was greater at any given moment. In gatherings, the atmosphere tightened whenever tensions rose. An unexpected comment might shift the tone of a conversation. causing eyes to lift and glance toward the person who had spoken. Those brief reactions revealed more than words: a furrowed brow, a stiff jaw, or a momentary pause became clues used to interpret loyalties. People studied these signs, and they remembered them. The absence of reaction could be equally revealing, suggesting indifference or hidden motives. The king's presence amplified these pressures. His gaze moved from person to person, searching for signs of agreement or dissent. He did not always speak when he noticed something unsettling. He simply remembered it. Those who failed to mirror his emotions, even slightly, found themselves under scrutiny. The heavy expectation of his attention created an atmosphere where sincerity felt dangerous, and performance became a means of survival. Rumors circulated quietly about individuals who had fallen from favor after a single encounter. Someone might have looked away too quickly or failed to smile at the appropriate moment. Others might have hesitated before responding to a question. These small actions, meaningless in ordinary life, gained significance in a place where gestures were scrutinized closely. People who witnessed such mistakes rarely forgot them. They served as reminders that danger required no dramatic event. It could come from something as simple as a momentary lapse in composure. As days passed, courtiers developed habits to protect themselves. They positioned themselves where the light fell softly across their faces, avoiding shadows that might distort their expressions. They practiced neutral looks in private rooms, trying to remove anything that could be misread. They reduced their movements, kept their hands still, and lowered their gaze when passing through crowded spaces. These precautions did not eliminate the threat, but they offered a thin barrier against misinterpretation. The most unnerving part of this environment was how invisible the danger could be. A person might feel secure, unaware that a single observer had noticed something small and carried it quietly to someone else. The chain continued, linking whispers, interpretations, and assumptions until the original act, an innocent glance, became the foundation of a charge. By the time the accused realized what had happened, their expression mattered no longer. Their fate had already been shaped by the way others chose to see them. Those who survived longest understood that self-control was not enough. They had to observe others, learning to predict how their actions might be perceived. They studied the king, the courtiers, and even the servants, adjusting their behavior to fit the shifting expectations around them. It was a constant performance, one that left little room for error and no room for authenticity. Their faces became masks worn for protection, crafted through years of caution. What endured in this setting was a quiet fear that settled into daily life. People breathed carefully, moved carefully, and existed carefully, aware that they navigated a landscape where nothing was spoken openly. Yet everything was judged. They accepted that danger did not emerge from battlefields or open conflict. It came from glances, simpler, fleeting moments that could alter their lives without warning. This world revealed how easily a single expression could redirect a person's fate. The tension built quietly around those moments, gathering strength in the spaces people tried to ignore. Something hidden within those sharpened observations waited to turn stillness into threat. Thomas Wolsey's presence in Henry VIII's court created a tension that many people learned to hide but never fully escaped. His rise had been unusual from the beginning, built not on noble heritage, but on an ability to manage the king's demands with precision. He moved through the palace with a confidence that reflected his authority. Yet his background remained a point of discomfort for those who believed power belonged only to established families. Every action he took reminded them that he had climbed into their world without sharing their lineage. Wolsey controlled many aspects of government, from foreign negotiations to domestic management. His decisions influenced trade, law, and the movement of resources across the kingdom. People who wished to advance in the court understood that approaching him was often more effective than approaching the king. This created resentment among nobles whose families had held influence for generations. They watched a man without their bloodline take a position that surpassed their own, and the quiet bitterness that formed around him grew steadily. His efficiency, which pleased the king, angered those who competed for favour. He conducted affairs quickly and with little hesitation, leaving others feeling excluded from processes they believed they should oversee. Some courtiers avoided him out of caution, others out of pride, but nearly all carried private doubts about how long his power would last. They studied his behaviour, waiting for signs of weakness, knowing that his success threatened their standing. Wolsey's wealth became a point of constant attention. His homes were grand, his servants numerous, and his clothing marked by colour and fabric that suggested rank beyond his birth. Even though the king approved of his prosperity, others saw it as excessive. They whispered about how he obtained it, questioning whether anyone should hold such luxury without noble roots. The contrast between his origins and his lifestyle made him an easy target for criticism. Even when the criticism was unfounded, diplomatic failures, whether real or imagined, were used against him. When foreign alliances shifted or negotiations stalled, people blamed him without waiting for an explanation. They interpreted setbacks as proof that he had reached beyond his abilities. In the same way, his successes were rarely acknowledged. If a treaty favoured England, others credited the king. If it faltered, Wolsey carried the responsibility alone. This imbalance shaped the atmosphere around him, creating a narrative of incompetence where competence was simply inconvenient. His control over church matters amplified the hostility. As a cardinal, he held influence that extended beyond the palace walls, shaping religious decisions that affected the entire country. This dual authority, spiritual and political, placed him in a position unmatched by anyone else near the king. Nobles considered it dangerous for a single man to hold so many roles. They believed his power distorted the natural order, and their discomfort turned into quiet opposition. People in his service watched him navigate these pressures with calm determination. He worked long hours, often beginning before dawn and continuing until late evening. His attention to detail left little room for mistakes. But effort alone could not erase resentment. Those who stood beside him sensed that his position rested on a foundation that could shift unexpectedly. They moved carefully, knowing that their connection to him made them vulnerable to the ambitions of others. Within the court, conversations about him occurred in controlled tones. People rarely criticized him openly, but they shared doubts through slight gestures or carefully phrased remarks. A raised eyebrow, a pause before answering, or a subtle shift in posture signaled their opinions without stating them directly. These signals spread quickly, forming an undercurrent of resistance that Wolsey could not fully counter. He remained aware of the hostility, but continued his work as if unaware, demonstrating the discipline of someone accustomed to standing alone. His relationship with the king offered both strength and fragility. Henry valued Wolsey's ability to solve problems efficiently, but the king's unpredictable nature made reliance dangerous. A moment of frustration or disappointment could undo years of service. Wolsey understood this. He monitored the king's moods with the same attention others used to monitor him. A poorly chosen word, even from Wolsey, could open a path for his enemies to push him aside. When the matter of Henry's marriage emerged, Wolsey's enemies saw an opportunity. They observed the king's growing impatience and recognized that Wolsey could be blamed for delays. They whispered that he lacked commitment, that he delayed progress intentionally, or that he served his own interests. None of these claims needed to be proven. The environment of the court allowed suspicion to grow without evidence. Over time, the accumulated complaints formed a single impression. Wolsey had become too powerful. His fall came quietly at first, marked by small signs that he no longer commanded the same authority. People hesitated before bowing. Requests were delayed or ignored. Those who once sought his favour redirected their attention elsewhere. His household sensed the shift and carried itself with a subdued heaviness. They knew that the court rarely forgave the powerful once their decline became visible. By the time accusations took shape, Wolsey's position had already weakened. His enemies did not need a major crime to remove him. They needed only the king's willingness to doubt him. They presented circumstances in a way that made his downfall appear inevitable. The king's frustration grew, and Wolsey's explanations carried less weight than before. He was stripped of titles, separated from influence, and left to face the consequences of a campaign built from years of quiet resentment. What made his end striking was how little resistance he offered. He understood that the forces against him had waited patiently, and now their opportunity had come. His life's work did not protect him, nor did his accomplishments soften the judgment of those who had wanted his removal. He was left with the reality that his greatest flaw, in the eyes of others, had been his success. His rise showed how far one man could climb through skill alone. The quiet hostility that surrounded him revealed how eagerly others prepared for his fall. Another shift in the court waited beyond his departure, ready to reshape the kingdom once more. Anne Boleyn's arrival in the English court altered the quiet balance that many had grown accustomed to. She entered not with titles or long-established connections, but with a presence that drew attention in ways others could not ignore. Her manner was controlled, her speech measured, and her confidence unmistakable. These qualities unsettled people who believed influence belonged only to those who had inherited it. The Boleyn family, once peripheral in court affairs, began to move steadily closer to the centre of power. And that movement did not go unnoticed. Anne's interactions with the king created a shift that spread through every room of the palace. The king's admiration for her was immediate, but it developed in a way that disrupted established structures. People who had relied on traditional alliances now found themselves adjusting to a new figure whose influence did not follow predictable lines. Her rise was not gradual. It carried the force of someone propelled by circumstances larger than any personal ambition. This made her both remarkable and dangerous in the eyes of those who observed her closely. As Anne gained favour, her family's position strengthened. Relatives who once held minor roles gained access to discussions previously reserved for long-standing nobility. Invitations reached them more quickly, and their opinions began to appear in conversations where they had once been excluded. This transformation was swift enough to provoke discomfort among older families who viewed themselves as natural guardians of the court. The Boleyn's ascent appeared to defy the customs that had shaped political life for generations. Criticism grew quietly around Anne, especially among those who felt threatened by her presence. Some saw her as a disruptive force, others as a symbolic challenge to the established order. People questioned her motives, interpreting her poise as calculation and her confidence as defiance. These judgments circulated through corridors and private chambers, forming a quiet resistance long before open conflict developed. Even her supporters noticed the tension, but understood that favour from the king carried both advantage and risk. Anne's connection to the king extended beyond personal affection. Her influence intersected with broader political and religious changes. The king's desire to annul his marriage transformed her into a focal point of national conflict. She became associated with ideas and reforms that reshaped the country's structure. Supporters of these changes viewed her as a symbol of progress, while opponents saw her as an intrusion into matters they believed sacred. Whether she intended it or not, her presence intensified disputes that had been simmering beneath the surface. The weight of expectation placed upon her grew steadily. She was judged not only as a woman seeking marriage, but as a figure tied to the future of the monarchy. Every gesture she made, whether in public or in private, was examined for signs of ambition or instability. People who disliked her interpreted her actions through a lens shaped by resentment. Her intelligence, which had once been admired by some, became evidence of manipulation for others. This shift in perception created an environment where neutrality was almost impossible. When she became queen, the atmosphere around her changed sharply. The crown did not shield her from scrutiny, it amplified it. Those who had lost influence because of her rise carried their bitterness forward, waiting for any opportunity to reverse their fortunes. Others who had remained quiet began to distance themselves, uncertain of how long her power would last. The court around her moved with caution, aware that each interaction could be recorded and used as evidence of loyalty or betrayal. Anne's inability to produce a male heir intensified the pressure surrounding her. People observed her closely, noting her expressions, posture, and reactions during public appearances. Her moments of frustration or fear became topics of speculation. Rumors expanded quickly, creating narratives that had little connection to reality but considerable impact on her safety. Even those who sympathized with her understood that sympathy offered no protection. The Boleyn family felt the same pressure. Their rise, once celebrated by those seeking favor, now become a liability. People who had aligned themselves with the Boleyns shifted their loyalties elsewhere, leaving the family exposed. Their influence, once growing with each passing month, began to erode quietly. The same families who had resented their ascent found satisfaction in watching their vulnerability emerge. As accusations formed around Anne, the court moved with a steadiness that suggested preparation rather than surprise. The charges did not need substantial evidence. They needed only a moment when the king's frustration aligned with the ambitions of her enemies. That moment arrived with striking efficiency. Individuals who had once stood near her were questioned, detained, or implicated. The network of rumor and resentment that had followed her for years finally converged, shaping a narrative that justified her removal. Her trial occurred under conditions that allowed little chance for defense. Observers understood that the outcome had been decided before proceedings began. The court did not seek justice, it sought closure. Anne's fall served the interests of many, from those who had envied her influence to those who believed her absence would restore order. Her execution became a symbolic act that erased not only her presence, but the power her family had gathered. The collapse of the Boleyn family was rapid. Titles were withdrawn, lands reassigned, and reputations recast in the language of disgrace. Their ascent, which had once seemed unstoppable, now served as a cautionary story for anyone who rose too quickly. The court returned to its earlier rhythms, but a quiet awareness lingered. The system did not forget those who disrupted it, and it did not hesitate to correct its trajectory with severity. Her rise showed how quickly influence could gather around a single person. The forces that opposed her revealed how deeply the court resisted unfamiliar power. Something within that shifting landscape continued to wait, preparing to unsettle the kingdom again. Thomas More and Thomas Cromwell occupied positions that brought them close to the centre of power. Yet the paths that led them there could not have been more different. More carried a reputation shaped by learning, restraint, and devotion to principles that predated the king's authority. Cromwell rose through calculation, labour, and a sharp understanding of how the court functioned beneath its polished surface. Their methods diverged, their beliefs conflicted, and their temperaments formed opposite ends of a spectrum. Still, both men operated within the same environment, and that environment demanded a level of caution that neither fully met. More approached political life with a seriousness that reflected his private convictions. His decisions were informed by beliefs he considered immovable, and he refused to alter these beliefs even when the court shifted around him. He spoke with measured clarity, choosing each word as though it carried moral weight. Many respected him for this. Yet respect offered little safety. In a place where flexibility often meant survival, his consistency appeared rigid and uncooperative. People observed his hesitation during discussions of reform and interpreted it as defiance rather than conscience. His refusal to endorse the king's decisions placed him in a dangerous position. At first, he attempted to retreat quietly from public affairs, hoping that silence would shield him. But silence, in the eyes of the court, could be interpreted as judgment. It suggested a refusal to support the king openly, and such a refusal became a threat. More's physical presence remained calm, but the tension around him increased. Each restrained gesture, each measured response, indicated that he would not bend. For a king who expected affirmation, this restraint became unacceptable. Cromwell, in contrast, displayed an adaptability that allowed him to rise despite lacking noble birth. He maneuvered through the court with a steady awareness of shifting alliances and the king's unpredictable moods. His skill lay in identifying opportunities and acting before others realized the ground had shifted. He drafted policies, managed disputes, and used administrative precision to build influence that spread through every corner of the government. His success depended not on heritage, but on understanding the mechanisms of power as they truly operated. Yet Cromwell's strength created its own vulnerabilities. His efficiency made him indispensable for a time. But indispensability could turn into suspicion. As he shaped reforms and managed delicate matters, people began to see him as someone whose reach extended too far. His decisions disrupted lives, weakened established families, and strengthened factions that opposed traditional structures. Those who resented him collected their grievances quietly, waiting for the moment when the king's favour began to fade. The contrast between the two men became evident in how they faced danger. More responded by withdrawing into silence, believing that refusing to speak against his principles would shield him. Cromwell continued to act, believing that action could maintain stability, but both approaches carried risks. Silence could be framed as resistance, and action could be framed as ambition. In the court, interpretation mattered more than intent, and both men eventually discovered that control over their own choices did not extend to how others presented those choices. More's death arrived through a formal process that disguised inevitability as legality. He stood before those who judged him with the same calm expression he had worn throughout his life. His refusal to declare the king's supremacy became the foundation of the case against him. He did not resist. He did not attempt negotiation. He simply accepted the consequences of a principle that he refused to abandon. The court carried on around him, unchanged by the loss, except for the quiet reminder that conviction had little value in an environment shaped by shifting demands. Cromwell's fall occurred with a suddenness that reflected the fragility of power built through service. For years, he had managed the king's affairs, solving problems others feared to confront. But a single miscalculation, a marriage arrangement that displeased the king, became the opening his enemies needed. They presented accusations crafted from years of resentment, portraying him as disloyal, overly ambitious, and corrupt. The king, frustrated and eager to distance himself from the failed union, accepted these accusations with minimal resistance. When Cromwell was arrested, the court reacted with an unsettling familiarity. People who had once depended on him for advancement now stepped back, careful not to show any sign of allegiance. His presence, once commanding, became a warning of how quickly influence could evaporate. He attempted to defend himself, appealing to his years of service, but the political climate no longer supported him. His downfall was swift, and his execution removed a man whose influence had once shaped the kingdom's direction. The deaths of More and Cromwell revealed a truth that many in the court already understood but rarely expressed. Loyalty to the king offered no protection unless it matched his expectations at every moment. Principles could not withstand royal frustration, and competence could not withstand royal disappointment. People who observed the fates of these two men learned that survival required a level of caution that neither conviction nor achievement could guarantee. In private rooms and secluded corridors, their stories circulated quietly. Some spoke of More's unwavering beliefs, others of Cromwell's tireless efforts. Yet these reflections did little to change the reality that the court rewarded neither steadfastness nor diligence. It rewarded those who managed to remain unnoticed during times of tension, and those who avoided drawing the king's attention when decisions turned unpredictable. Their legacies became reminders of how fragile power truly was. One man fell because he would not speak, the other fell because he spoke too effectively. The contrast between them outlined the boundaries of survival in a world where intentions mattered less than perception and where outcomes were shaped by factors beyond any individual's control. Their fates revealed how little protection, conviction, or accomplishment offered in a court ruled by shifting moods. The movements surrounding their rise and fall hinted at deeper forces guiding the kingdom's unrest. Somewhere in those changes, another tension waited quietly, ready to impose its weight on those who remained. Whispers in Henry VIII's court carried a weight far greater than open accusations. People understood that danger did not come from raised voices or heated arguments. It came from quiet words exchanged in corners where footsteps softened and candles burned low. A sentence spoken in a low tone could reshape a person's fate more effectively than any formal complaint. Those who wished to cause harm rarely announced their intentions. They allowed suspicion to grow slowly, feeding it with fragments of information delivered at the precise moment when the king's mood would turn their words into consequences. Courtiers learned to navigate these murmurs with caution. They observed how someone leaning slightly toward the king during a gathering could alter the atmosphere in the room. The angle of a head, the pause before speaking, the faintest lowering of a voice. These gestures often signaled that information was being offered. No one else needed to hear the content to understand its significance. A whisper meant influence. And influence in this court was a tool that could be used to undermine rivals without leaving evidence behind. People who positioned themselves near the king faced constant scrutiny. Their proximity suggested trust, but it also increased the risk of attracting hostility from others. Every conversation they held with him, even brief exchanges, they was watched from a distance. Observers attempted to decipher whether they were advising, warning, or accusing. A moment of closeness could raise suspicion, while a moment of distance could signal loss of favor. This fragile balance made interactions with the king resemble a quiet negotiation for survival. Those who sought to harm their rivals understood this environment well. They did not challenge others openly. Instead, they waited for opportunities when the king felt frustration, uncertainty, or anger. In those moments, a subtle suggestion could become a foundation for serious doubt. The whisperer did not need to state an accusation directly. A question framed carefully, or a remark disguised as concern, could lead the king to draw conclusions that served their interests. Once the doubt formed, it grew quickly. Courtiers feared the power of these whispers because they travelled faster than truth. Someone might find themselves the subject of suspicion without knowing when or where the rumour began. They would notice changes first in how people greeted them. Slower bows, measured smiles, cautious eyes. Invitations might arrive less frequently. Servants who once stood close might shift to a greater distance. These small signals revealed that a whisper had already started shaping their reputation long before they had the chance to defend themselves. The king's reactions intensified the danger. Henry listened selectively, responding not only to the content of what he heard, but to the tone in which it was delivered. A whispered warning presented as loyalty could hold his attention longer than a detailed explanation offered publicly. Those who understood his temperament adjusted their strategies accordingly. They kept their voices low, framed their words as expressions of concern, and allowed the king to finish the conclusion for them. This allowed them to avoid responsibility while guiding the decisions that followed. Whispers often emerged from those who lacked military strength or political alliances. Their power grew from subtlety rather than force. A carefully timed remark could remove a rival more effectively than an army, because it exploited the king's sensitivity to betrayal. People discovered that influence depended not on what they could prove, but on what they could imply. A single suggestion that someone acted with disloyalty or ambition could lead to investigation, imprisonment, or worse. The court did not require evidence. It required plausibility. Some individuals attempted to protect themselves by limiting what they said in public. They avoided taking sides, avoided lengthy opinions, and avoiding being seen speaking privately with anyone who had fallen from favor. But avoiding words did not prevent others from speaking about them. Silence became a space that others could fill with their own interpretations. A person who did not speak might still become the subject of whispers that shaped how the court perceived them. The networks that carried these murmurs were woven through every level of palace life. Servants overheard discussions and repeated fragments to one another. Courtiers reinterpreted these fragments, adding assumptions that suited their plans. Advisors shaped these assumptions into warnings framed for the king. The original words often disappeared beneath layers of retelling, but their impact remained. A whisper could travel across the entire court before the accused even realized they had become a target. What made this environment particularly unsettling was how ordinary the process appeared. Conversations happened in hallways, at tables, or during ceremonies without drawing attention. People stood close together out of necessity, and proximity made secrecy easier. No one raised their voice, no one displayed outrage. By the time a rumor became powerful enough to destroy someone, the court had already accepted it as truth. The accused rarely had the chance to understand how far the whisper had spread. The king's decisions reflected this quiet influence. He often acted with confidence, believing he had reached conclusions independently, unaware of how carefully his thoughts had been shaped by others. Those who guided him felt satisfaction without exposing themselves to risk. They remained visible only as loyal servants offering concern, never as the source of the outcomes that followed. Their opponents disappeared from the court silently, leaving no trace except the empty spaces they once occupied. This dynamic created a climate where people trusted no one fully. They monitored their own behavior, avoided sharing private thoughts, and questioned the intentions of those around them. Even friendships became fragile under the weight of suspicion. A single whispered remark could transform companionship into danger. People who believed they could rely on allies learned that alliances dissolved quickly when whispers carried greater promise. Ultimately, the court functioned like a system built from secrets. Those who mastered the art of speaking quietly held disproportionate power, while those who relied on honesty or straightforward action found themselves vulnerable. The walls seemed to absorb these murmurs, carrying them forward until they reached the king at a moment when they could do the most harm. It was a structure that rewarded subtlety and punished transparency. These quiet strategies revealed how influence moved beneath the surface of the court. The tension surrounding these subtle exchanges grew heavier with each whispered suggestion. Something within that hidden network waited for its chance to shift the balance once more. Titles in Henry VIII's court created an appearance of order, yet beneath their polished surfaces lay a system shaped by quiet struggles for influence. A title did not simply mark status, it rearranged alliances, altered expectations, and signaled shifts that could affect every individual connected to the one who received it. People watched these changes closely, understanding that each new elevation introduced a new balance of power. A man who gained a title in the morning could find himself surrounded by eager supporters by afternoon, each hoping to secure a place in his growing circle. These titles functioned as tools more than honors. When the king granted one, it acted like a silent announcement of trust, even if the reasoning behind the choice remained unclear. Those who observed the recipient adjusted their behavior immediately. Some moved closer, offering help or small gestures of loyalty. Others kept their distance, calculating whether the rise threatened their own position. The court shifted around every new title the way a landscape shifts around a sudden change in weather. People sensed possibilities and dangers forming in equal measure. The newly elevated individual experienced a transformation that went far beyond clothing or ceremony. Their words carried greater weight. Their presence altered the dynamics of conversations. People who had once spoken freely now chose their phrases carefully. Invitations arrived more frequently, and expectations rose with them. Yet this change carried an undercurrent of risk. The higher a person stood, the more closely others examined their actions. A misstep that once passed unnoticed might now be scrutinized and repeated in whispers. Families attached to these titles felt the pressure just as strongly. A single elevation could bring prosperity to an entire lineage, offering opportunities that had previously been out of reach. Children gained access to positions, marriages, and education that reshaped their futures. But the same elevation could draw resentment from those who believed the family was undeserving. Rival groups developed quietly, framing the rise as a threat that required a response. The court did not allow success to exist without opposition, and the stability of a title depended on how effectively its holder managed these tensions. People learned to observe the king's expressions during ceremonies, because his reaction revealed more than the title itself. A moment of hesitation, a forced smile, or a distracted glance could suggest that the elevation was strategic rather than sincere. Courtiers who studied the king carefully understood that sincerity mattered little compared to utility. They saw that the king used titles to build temporary alliances, reward compliance, or weaken opposing factions. The motives were often unclear, but the effects were unmistakable. Some individuals accepted titles reluctantly, aware that increased visibility brought increased vulnerability. They understood that the court rewarded those who remained within acceptable boundaries, but punished those who appeared too ambitious. A title easily pushed someone toward the edge of that boundary. People who wished to survive learned to carry their new honors with restraint, behaving modestly even when others urged them to expand their influence. Resisting that temptation became a form of self-preservation. Others embraced their titles with enthusiasm, confident in their ability to navigate court politics. They expanded their networks, sought new opportunities, and allowed their presence to grow more prominent. But this confidence often attracted scrutiny. The court held long memories, and those who rose quickly faced the same quiet hostility once aimed at families like the Boleyns. Their actions were monitored, their decisions questioned, and their successes interpreted as warnings rather than achievements. The fragility of these titles became clear in how quickly they could be removed. A person who enjoyed full favor one day could lose everything the next, without explanation. The king's frustrations, shifting alliances, or new political aims could erase years of service. Even the strongest titles offered no guarantee of permanence. People who had supported the newly honored individual might abandon them instantly when signs of decline appeared. Loyalty in the court moved towards safety, not principle. The speed of these reversals created an atmosphere in which no one felt secure. Celebrations of new titles were tempered by the awareness that the same honor could become a liability. People congratulated one another politely, but beneath their words lay the recognition that elevation made someone more visible, and visibility carried risk. Banners, feasts, and ceremonies masked the uncertainty that lingered around every advancement. Courtiers adjusted their strategies accordingly. Some sought titles not for prestige but for protection, believing that formal recognition would anchor their place in the court. Others avoided seeking elevation altogether, preferring positions that allowed them to observe without drawing too much attention. They recognized that the court punished boldness as easily as failure, and they valued endurance more than recognition. Those who survived longest often occupied roles that seemed modest but offered stability. The king understood the impact of these titles and used them to maintain control. He granted honors to create divisions, remove threats, or reward obedience. His decisions influenced how people interacted, how they formed alliances, and how they assessed their own futures. The distribution of titles became a method of shaping the court without issuing direct commands. Those who received them became instruments in a larger system they did not fully see. What made the system particularly unsettling was its quiet efficiency. No loud proclamations, no public disputes, only shifts in posture, tone, and distance marked the rise or fall of a title's value. People did not need to speak openly about these changes. They adapted through observation alone. The court functioned as a living structure, adjusting itself around each new honor and each newly fallen figure with silent steadiness. These shifting honours revealed how unstable advancement truly was within the palace. The movements around each new elevation created a tension that pressed quietly against those who watched. Another transformation hovered at the edge of these changes, waiting to alter the order once again. Anne Boleyn's fall unfolded with a speed that unsettled even those accustomed to the court's unpredictability. Her presence, once central to the king's attention, became a source of discomfort as the atmosphere around her shifted. People who had once observed her confidently walking through the palace corridors now sensed the tension forming at the edges of her world. Small gestures, slight pauses in conversation, restrained greetings, the absence of her name in discussions, signaled that the foundation beneath her had begun to erode. The shift did not begin with formal accusations, but with murmurs spoken softly enough to escape immediate scrutiny. The absence of evidence mattered little. What mattered was the accumulation of resentment that surrounded her rise. Families who had opposed her influence found ways to reframe old grievances. Her confidence, once interpreted as strength, became portrayed as arrogance. Her alliances appeared threatening rather than strategic. People who felt overshadowed by her presence began to reshape their observations into convenient narratives. These narratives travelled through private rooms and narrow staircases until they reached those willing to present them to the king in a form he would accept. Anne's position made her vulnerable to these whispers. As queen, she was visible, and visibility in this court meant exposure. Every glance she exchanged, every conversation she held, every expression she wore could be interpreted in ways that suited her enemies. The people who surrounded her, friends, musicians, ladies in waiting, carried their own vulnerabilities. Their closeness to her provided opportunities for accusations to spread beyond her alone. A gesture interpreted incorrectly, or a conversation overheard partially, could become part of a larger pattern constructed by those who aimed to remove her. The king's growing dissatisfaction amplified these dangers. His discontent created an opening for those who wished to reshape the court's structure. They presented their suspicions not as hostility but as concern, framing their allegations as efforts to protect the king from betrayal. The vagueness of the accusations made them difficult to confront. No specific act needed to be proven. Only the impression of misconduct had to be strong enough to justify action. People watched as this impression expanded until it filled every space Anne once occupied. The arrests began quietly. Men associated with her were taken first, each seized under the suspicion of improper conduct. Their shock did little to influence the direction of events. The interrogations turned fragments of conversation into implications of guilt, and implications became statements when placed before those eager to present a complete story. These men became pieces in a narrative they could not control. Servants, courtiers, and acquaintances found themselves swept into a process shaped less by fact than by momentum. Anne's own arrest reflected the court's ability to move with calm precision. Guards approached her without urgency, not explaining the requirement that she appear for questioning. The palace continued its daily routines, while whispers about her fate spread through its halls. People avoided meeting her gaze, aware that any sign of sympathy might be interpreted as alignment with her supposed crimes. She entered confinement with a mixture of disbelief and stillness, understanding that resistance would serve no purpose. Inside the tower, the structure of her life changed abruptly. Rooms that had once held private discussions now felt like spaces where every sound might be monitored. The absence of her household emphasized her isolation. The king's silence made the situation more threatening than any spoken accusation. She had seen others fall from favor, but the speed of her own decline revealed how little protection position offered when the court turned against someone. The trial proceeded with an appearance of formality that concealed its predetermined nature. Statements were presented as though they represented truth, yet many were shaped by fear, pressure, or personal ambition. Those who testified did so with the awareness that refusing could endanger their own safety. Their words became part of a process that relied less on detail than on the need to confirm the king's resolution. Observers recognized this but remained silent, knowing their futures depended on maintaining distance from the case. Anne listened to the charges with a composure that contrasted sharply with the intensity of the accusations. Her responses, though measured, carried little influence. The outcome had already been shaped by the forces that operated around the throne. People saw that her fall served multiple purposes. It satisfied political enemies, aligned with the king's shifting desires, and reinforced the message that no one, regardless of status, stood beyond the reach of suspicion. Her execution marked more than a personal tragedy. It demonstrated how easily perception could replace fact in determining someone's fate. Women in the court understood this immediately. They recognized that behavior, once considered acceptable, could become dangerous depending on how it was described. Friendships became cautionary gestures, and silence became a strategy for self-preservation. They saw that Anne's death functioned as a warning delivered without the need for explicit instruction. After the event, the palace resumed its routines. New alliances formed quietly, and conversations shifted toward future arrangements. People who had once benefited from Anne's favor adjusted their loyalties with practiced steadiness. Her absence created space for others to rise, and the court filled that space without hesitation. The speed with which life continued revealed how accustomed the environment had become to sudden reversals. Anne's downfall remained a subject of quiet reflection among those who witnessed it. Some considered the fragility of status, others the cruelty of rumor. Yet these reflections rarely influenced behavior. The court remained a place where appearances mattered more than truth, and where power moved along unstable pathways. Anne's story fit into this pattern as another example of how lives could be altered by whispers, shaped to meet the needs of the moment. Her collapse revealed how easily influence dissolved once suspicion took hold. The atmosphere surrounding her final days carried a heaviness that lingered after the accusations faded. Within that weight, another shift was prepared to emerge, waiting to unsettle those who believed themselves untouched. Jane Seymour's presence in the court differed from the women who came before her. She did not seek attention, did not challenge the atmosphere around her, and did not attempt to stand out in conversations or gatherings. Her movements were measured, her expressions restrained, and her posture consistently composed. This quiet demeanor allowed her to exist within the palace without provoking resistance. People noticed her, but they rarely reacted to her. She created no disturbances, offered no threats, and left no traces that others could transform into accusations. In a court shaped by suspicion, her silence became the most effective strategy for survival. Her family followed a similar pattern. The Seymours appeared loyal without showcasing ambition, present without imposing themselves, and respectful without becoming submissive. Their approach blended into the structure of the court so seamlessly that others failed to recognize the gradual expansion of their influence. They occupied roles that placed them near the king while avoiding actions that might draw criticism. Their method relied not on bold gestures, but on steady alignment with the environment's expectations. This allowed them to gain trust without being perceived as competitors. Jane's quiet behavior had a particular effect on the king. After the volatility and tension surrounding his previous marriage, he responded to the calm she presented. Her silence did not challenge him, and her restraint created a contrast to the conflicts he had recently experienced. The absence of forceful opinions or disruptive actions gave him a sense of stability that he had sought but rarely found. She did not press for influence. She did not attempt to manipulate the court. Yet her presence grew more significant because it offered the king something the environment around him lacked: predictability. People observing her relationship with the king noticed the shift, but struggled to identify what had caused it. Her rise did not follow the usual pattern of strategic alliances or overt displays of charm. Instead, it developed through the king's gradual preference for someone who represented simplicity in a court filled with noise. This preference allowed the Seymour family to move quietly toward the center of power. They did not need to ask for positions. opportunities formed naturally around them. As their influence expanded, the Seymours avoided drawing attention to their gains. They understood that rapid advancement often produced resentment, so they allowed their rise to appear aligned with the king's needs rather than their own desires. Their discretion prevented rival families from forming a united opposition. People watched them grow stronger, but found it difficult to argue against the subtlety of their methods. The Seymours did not disrupt the court, they blended into its existing rhythms. Jane's behaviour within the palace reflected the same calculated restraint. She performed her duties without complaint, avoided unnecessary social entanglements, and maintained a distance from conflict. Her expressions remained controlled, and her conversations carried no tone that others could reinterpret. For women in the court, her rise presented a model of influence based not on assertion, but on caution. Yet this model remained difficult to imitate, because it required a level of self-restraint that few possessed. The birth of Edward marked the peak of the Seymour family's success. The arrival of a male heir carried enormous significance, reshaping the future of the monarchy and securing the family's position. The court reacted with formal celebration, but beneath the rituals, people quietly reassessed the balance of power. The Seymours, once peripheral figures, now occupied a central place in the kingdom's future. Their influence did not depend on titles or personal ambition. It depended on the existence of a child who would inherit the throne. Despite this elevation, the family maintained their characteristic subtlety. They avoided triumph, avoiding behaviour that could be interpreted as victory over other factions. This restraint protected them during a moment when others might have reacted with hostility. They allowed the king's joy to take precedence and offered no signs of their internal satisfaction. Their caution made their position appear natural rather than imposed. Jane's death shortly after Edward's birth added a complex stillness to her legacy. She left the court without ever having entered its conflicts. Her absence created fewer ripples than the departures of queens before her. Yet the impact of her life extended beyond her personal story. Those who observed the court realized that her silence had accomplished what ambition could not. She secured the future of her family through quiet presence rather than forceful participation. In the years that followed, the Seymour name remained connected to the throne because of Edward. Their influence persisted through his upbringing and through the alliances that formed around his minority. Their rise demonstrated that power could be gained not only through bold actions, but through careful absence from tension. Other families attempted to replicate this method, but few understood the precision required to use silence as a tool. The Seymours' ascent revealed how the court responded to subtlety. Their quiet strategy bypassed many of the dangers that consumed others. They did not provoke accusations. They did not draw attention to themselves. They allowed their surroundings to move naturally toward them, rather than forcing advancement. Their success became one of the clearest examples of how influence could develop without noise. For those who survived the court by avoiding exposure, the Seymours became a reminder that restraint could reshape the environment more effectively than confrontation. Yet this approach also carried risks. Silence protected them for a time, but it could not shield them from the unpredictable shifts that defined the monarchy. Their stability depended entirely on the king's preference and the survival of the heir whose birth had placed them at the centre of power. Their rise demonstrated how silence could alter the court more deeply than ambition. The atmosphere surrounding their influence remained steady, yet uncertainty pressed quietly against its edges. Within that uneasy calm, another conflict was prepared to touch those who hoped to remain untouched. The divisions within Henry VIII's court became unmistakable once the question of religion entered every conversation. Decision and alliance. What began as the king's personal dissatisfaction with his marriage expanded into a conflict that reached every corner of the palace. People who had once spoken freely about matters of faith learned to monitor their words carefully. A single statement could expose them to suspicion. And suspicion, in this environment, carried consequences that developed quietly, but struck with finality. The atmosphere changed from one of courtly maneuvering to one shaped by ideological fracture. The king's decision to break from the authority of the Pope altered the structure of the kingdom more rapidly than many expected. The shift required not just administrative adjustments, but shifts in loyalty that forced courtiers to reassess their positions overnight. Some aligned themselves with the king's new direction, believing that survival depended on supporting his will. Others maintained private allegiance to the old order, holding on to traditions that had shaped their families for generations. Yet neither group expressed their convictions openly. The walls of the palace absorbed every sound, and people understood the danger of speaking with certainty. This divide did not manifest through open conflict. It appeared instead through pauses in conversation, lowered voices, and subtle changes in posture when religious matters arose. People assessed one another quietly, attempting to determine which side each individual supported. Friendships became strained as individuals concealed their opinions to avoid misinterpretation. A remark made casually could be repeated later with altered intent, placing someone at risk without their knowledge. The court no longer operated solely on political calculation. It now carried the tension of moral accusation. The king's enforcement of the new religious order intensified these dynamics. Those who hesitated to endorse his authority were marked as traitors, regardless of their history of service. Those who embraced the new structure gained temporary favor, but faced hostility from those who saw them as betraying long-standing tradition. No clear path guaranteed safety. Individuals moved cautiously, aware that shifts in the king's emotions could redefine loyalty at any moment. People who had once managed political disagreements now navigated questions that touched their deepest convictions. The clergy who remained within the court faced particular pressure. They were expected to present alignment with the king's new direction while maintaining roles shaped by centuries of religious practice. Their sermons, prayers, and private advice were examined for any hint of resistance. Even silence could be interpreted as disapproval. Some adapted carefully, adjusting their tone and choosing scripture that supported the king's authority. Others faltered under the strain, revealing discomfort that placed them at risk of removal or worse. Families with long connections to the church encountered their own form of danger. Their histories, once a source of pride, became liabilities when others framed them as evidence of resistance. People monitored how often they attended religious services, which priests they visited, and which customs they maintained. Deviations from the new expectations, even minor ones, could prompt whispers that linked them to disloyalty. The line between faith and treason blurred as the court attempted to reshape its identity around the king's demands. Those who supported the reform movement discovered that alignment with the king did not eliminate vulnerability. Their advancement depended on continued usefulness, and usefulness shifted with political needs rather than conviction. Some who advocated strongly for reform found themselves isolated when the king's interest wavered. Their earlier statements became sources of danger when opponents used them to frame them as radicals. In the court, consistency offered no protection. Each moment required reassessment. The enforcement of the new order affected daily routines within the palace. Religious ceremonies changed in structure and tone. Symbols were removed, books replaced, and practices deemed inappropriate quietly abandoned. People observed these changes with caution, adjusting their behavior to avoid attracting attention. The difference between compliance and defiance became obscured, and fear of misinterpretation guided even the smallest gestures. Courtiers who once participated in rituals with confidence now moved through them with care. The executions that followed reinforced the severity of the divide. Individuals who failed to adapt fully were taken away without the opportunity to defend themselves. Their deaths served not just as punishment but as warnings. People understood that punishment did not depend on intent, it depended on perception. A single phrase, spoken at the wrong moment, could result in imprisonment or worse. The uncertainty surrounding these deaths increased the sense of unease that permeated the palace. These tensions extended beyond the walls of the court. People arriving from outside carried news of unrest, resistance, and confusion spreading through the kingdom. This external uncertainty heightened the pressure within the palace, as courtiers recognized that their positions depended not only on internal dynamics, but on how effectively the king could enforce his authority across the realm. The court became an extension of this broader conflict, reflecting its instability in every interaction. In private, individuals wrestled with the contradictions imposed by the new order. Some held their beliefs quietly, maintaining practices behind closed doors. Others abandoned former convictions to ensure stability. Yet few felt secure in their choices. The shifting expectations created a sense of constant vulnerability that touched every rank. They lived in a world where loyalty could not be demonstrated with certainty because its definition changed with the king's decisions. The divide created by this religious conflict revealed how fragile unity within the court truly was. What had once appeared as collective service to the crown became fragmented into competing interpretations of loyalty. The palace functioned under a surface of calm, but the weight of unspoken tension shaped every glance and every gesture. Individuals who hoped to survive learned to reduce their presence, to avoid revealing their convictions, and to align themselves not with ideology, but with preservation. These fractures showed how deeply uncertainty could seep into every corner of the court. The atmosphere surrounding each shift in belief pressed against those who had hoped to remain untouched. Somewhere in that growing divide, another struggle waited quietly for its moment to influence the kingdom's direction. Catherine Howard's presence in the court reflected a kind of restrained brightness that drew attention without demanding it. Her youth, her movements, and the soft tone of her voice created an image of ease. Yet beneath that surface, she occupied one of the most precarious positions in the entire palace. People observed her, noting how she walked, how she greeted others, and how she spoke in gatherings. The smallest gesture could be interpreted in ways she never intended. Her position as queen offered visibility, but visibility in Henry VIII's court carried risks that developed quietly and without warning. Her past became the source of a tension she could not control. Whispered fragments of her earlier life had followed her into the palace, carried by individuals who recognized the value of information in an environment where suspicion could be transformed into influence. These fragments did not form a complete story, but they created enough unease that people began to repeat them in low tones. The more these whispers circulated, the more they were shaped, altered, and sharpened. Catherine had limited awareness of how much had been said or who had repeated it. Yet the whispering continued to gather weight. Those who surrounded her recognized the danger long before she did. They understood that the court did not require certainty to take action. It required only the suggestion of impropriety. A look held too long, a private conversation observed by the wrong person, or a memory shared carelessly, could all become part of a larger narrative, constructed by those who wished to change the structure of power. People watched her closely, aware that any sign interpreted as a lack of purity could shift the king's perception abruptly. The king's mood shaped the speed at which these whispers gained strength. His initial affection for Catherine offered temporary stability, but his reactions to even faint suggestions of betrayal magnified the danger. People who wished to undermine her presented their concerns carefully, framing them as worries for his well-being rather than direct accusations. Their tone remained soft, their posture respectful, and their words chosen with precision. They understood that subtlety enhanced credibility, and credibility made suspicion more difficult to refute. Catherine's behavior within the palace reflected her attempt to maintain calm while surrounded by uncertainty she could not fully identify. She followed expected routines, attended ceremonies, and spoke with restraint. Yet her efforts could not prevent the circulation of rumors that took on shape independent of her actions. People interpreted her shyness as guilt, her politeness as hesitation, and her fear as confirmation of wrongdoing. In a court where perception mattered more than truth, these interpretations posed greater danger than any concrete accusation. As the whispers intensified, those closest to her felt the shift. Servants adjusted their tone. Courtiers avoided lingering near her, and individuals who once sought her favor created distance. The isolation developed gradually, pressing against her movements with increasing weight. She attempted to preserve normalcy, but each day carried signs that the court no longer viewed her as secure. The quiet avoidance revealed more than spoken warnings ever could. When formal allegations emerged, they did so with a sense of inevitability, shaped by the whispers that had circulated for months. The accusations focused not on her actions as queen, but on her life before entering the palace. People who had once been ignored were now brought forward to recount memories that could be framed as evidence. Their statements, shaped by pressure or by the desire to appear helpful, provided the structure necessary to move forward with the case against her. The court accepted these accounts readily, not because they were complete, but because they matched the narrative already built through rumour. Catherine faced this process with a mixture of confusion and fear. She lacked the political experience to navigate such accusations, and the speed of the investigation left her with little opportunity to defend herself. The court's judgment did not depend on her explanations. It depended on the king's reaction, and the king's reaction depended on how effectively others framed her past as betrayal. Once the king accepted this framing, the outcome approached with steady and unstoppable momentum. Her execution demonstrated how little protection status offered in an environment shaped by suspicion. Queens before her had faced danger for various reasons, but Catherine's downfall emphasized how fragile a woman's position could be when her past became public property. The court interpreted her life not as a personal history, but as a reflection of loyalty. A single suggestion that she had been less than pure became grounds for condemnation. Her youth offered no mercy. Her tears altered nothing. For women within the palace, their fate altered their behavior immediately. They monitored their own interactions carefully, aware that innocence offered no defense against accusations shaped by others. They learned to avoid situations that could be misinterpreted, to limit conversations that might travel beyond intended listeners, and to keep their histories concealed whenever possible. The court became even quieter, as though sound itself carried threat. Her death reinforced a truth that many already understood. Loyalty did not protect those who became objects of suspicion. Catherine had displayed no defiance, no schemes, and no ambition that threatened the court directly. Yet none of these qualities prevented her downfall. Her vulnerability came not from her actions, but from the way others chose to describe her. That description, once accepted by the king, became irreversible. People reflected on her fate with a mixture of discomfort and resignation. Some considered her naive. Others saw her as a casualty of a system that demanded purity, while exploiting those who could not meet its shifting expectations. Yet these reflections remained private. No one attempted to reshape the narrative publicly. The court moved forward without acknowledging the fear her death intensified. Her collapse revealed how quickly innocence could be reinterpreted once whispers took hold. The atmosphere left behind carried the weight of caution that pressed against everyone who remained near the throne. Within that silence, something else was prepared to influence those who hoped to stay beyond the reach of rumour. Ladies-in-waiting moved through the palace with a quiet familiarity that allowed them to pass unnoticed, even as they observed everything. Their presence extended across private chambers, dining rooms, and chapels, giving them access to conversations and gestures that others never saw. They learned details not through deliberate listening, but through proximity. A whispered remark exchanged in a hallway, a change in tone during a private discussion, or a moment of hesitation in the Queen's expression became part of their awareness. In a court shaped by suspicion, this awareness carried significant power. Their roles required them to stand close enough to hear without appearing to pay attention. They assisted in dressing, prepared rooms for ceremonies, and accompanied their mistresses through daily routines. These tasks placed them in positions where information travelled easily. Courtiers, believing themselves safe in the company of women they regarded as background figures, sometimes spoke too freely. They forgot that the presence of a servant did not mean the absence of observation. The ladies-in-waiting absorbed these fragments silently, understanding that even the smallest detail might prove valuable. Some of these women used their knowledge cautiously, choosing to reveal only what kept them secure. Others recognized that information could be exchanged for a favor. They moved carefully between households, shaping their loyalties based on necessity rather than preference. A single sentence repeated at the right moment could shift alliances. A withheld detail could protect someone long enough to avoid suspicion. Their influence did not result from formal authority, but from consistent exposure to private realities that others attempted to hide. Control over the staff who served the queen often indicated who held indirect power in the palace. Families and factions understood this, competing quietly to place their own women into positions near those whose influence affected the kingdom's direction. A lady-in-waiting associated with a particular household carried her family's interests with her. Even if she never spoke of them openly, her observations became part of a wider network, feeding information back to those who sought to shape events outside the Queen's awareness. In many cases, these women became the first to sense shifts in the Queen's stability. They noticed when she grew tense, when her correspondence increased, or when she received visitors more frequently. They understood the significance of letters delivered discreetly, or the appearance of advisors who remained only a short time behind closed doors. The ladies-in-waiting did not need explanations. Years spent near the center of power taught them how to interpret silence, pacing, and tone with accuracy. Their involvement extended beyond the Queen. They watched the interactions of courtiers who sought her attention, noting the eagerness of some and the hesitation of others. They learned which individuals approached the Queen with sincerity and which carried hidden agendas. These observations became valuable to anyone attempting to navigate the court's internal conflicts. People who sought information often turned to servants, knowing that those who lived closest to the Queen possessed insight unavailable through official channels. Occasionally, a lady-in-waiting found herself drawn into the political tensions surrounding her mistress. She might serve as a messenger, a witness, or an unintended participant in a conflict that reached beyond her role. Her words, even if spoken casually, could carry consequences. A remark that appeared harmless could later be shaped into a statement of accusation. Some women understood this risk and guarded their speech rigorously. Others lacked the experience to recognize when a private comment might later threaten their own security. The most dangerous situations arose when factions attempted to use these women to target the Queen. A whispered complaint might later be reported as evidence of impropriety. A shared story from the Queen's past, once viewed as harmless, could be transformed into the foundation of a scandal. The ladies-in-waiting became instruments in struggles they never intended to join. Their proximity to the Queen made them valuable, but that same proximity made them vulnerable to manipulation. The court's reliance on their presence created an environment where information circulated without a clear origin. People repeated details they could not verify, attributing them to servants whose identities were rarely questioned. A rumor could begin with a single observation and expand rapidly as it moved through corridors, kitchens, and chambers. By the time it reached figures of authority, it carried the weight of collective belief. The ladies-in-waiting often became associated with these rumors regardless of their involvement. Despite this, most of them attempted to maintain neutrality. Their goal was not to shape the court, but to survive it. They performed their duties with steady care, avoiding entanglements whenever possible. Yet they could not escape the awareness that their role placed them at the center of danger. They understood that anyone seeking to influence the court's future might use them as tools. Silence became their defense. But silence also allowed others to fill the void with interpretations they did not choose. The vulnerability of queens across Henry VIII's reign highlighted the significance of those who served them. Each downfall carried traces of information gathered, repeated, or manipulated by women who had witnessed too much. Their testimonies, whether coerced or voluntary, shaped investigations and confirmed suspicions. The court depended on them, while simultaneously regarding them as potential threats. This contradiction defined their existence. Their position reflected a broader truth about the palace. Those with no formal authority often held the clearest view of the structures that governed the kingdom. The ladies-in-waiting saw alliances form and dissolve. They knew which conversations carried weight and which gestures revealed fear. Their insights could either protect or destroy, depending on how others choose to interpret them. Their quiet presence revealed how deeply information flowed through the spaces others overlooked. The awareness they carried pressed steadily against the fragile balance surrounding the Queen. Somewhere within that shifting balance, another current waited to change the direction of influence once again. Elizabeth Blount remained one of the few individuals connected to Henry VIII who managed to leave the court without absorbing its full weight of danger. Her presence never carried the intensity or ambition seen in others who sought proximity to the king. She moved with ease that avoided attracting attention, speaking little, observing, and allowing circumstances to unfold without attempting to guide them. Her restraint became her strongest protection, shaping a life that intersected with the throne yet escaped the scrutiny that consumed so many others. Her relationship with the king developed quietly, without the dramatic tensions that marked his later affairs. She did not push for recognition, titles, or influence. When she bore the king a son, the event carried significant political implications. Yet Elizabeth resisted the temptation to exploit it. Many in her position would have sought security or advancement. Instead, she stepped back, allowing the court to adjust without pressing for a role within its shifting structure. Her lack of ambition made her difficult to criticize. People found no evidence of scheming, no signs of manipulation, and no behavior that could be framed as overreaching. Her family adopted a similar approach. They did not attempt to further embed themselves in the court's network. They accepted the connection to the king with restraint, avoiding the pursuit of favors that might draw attention. Their silence allowed them to remain untouched by the factions that sought to influence the monarchy's direction. In a court where alliances changed rapidly and loyalty became a fragile commodity, the Blount family positioned itself outside the primary currents of conflict. This absence from political entanglement protected them more effectively than any formal power could. Elizabeth's quiet withdrawal following the birth of her son revealed her understanding of the environment. She recognized that continued proximity to the king carried risks that might eventually turn against her. Remaining visible would invite both envy and suspicion. Leaving the court allowed her to maintain dignity and security without challenging others who sought influence. Her departure created minimal disturbance, and the court absorbed the transition with little struggle. People acknowledged her existence without feeling compelled to reshape their alliances. Her son, Henry Fitzroy, became a figure of interest because of his potential significance. His legitimacy as the king's acknowledged child placed him in discussions about succession. Yet Elizabeth did not use this connection to advance herself. She allowed others to manage his upbringing and education, maintaining a respectful distance. This distance prevented her from becoming entangled in the debates that surrounded his future. Her name did not appear in conflicts over his position or in disputes over how he should be raised. By remaining separate, she avoided becoming a tool in the hands of those who sought to control the king's lineage. People within the court often overlooked Elizabeth because she did not participate in the social maneuvering that defined palace life. She did not seek influence over policies, did not involve herself in religious debates, and did not appear interested in the distribution of titles. Her absence from these areas created an impression of harmlessness. In a world where individuals were frequently judged by the ambitions others assigned to them, her disinterest shielded her from misinterpretation. She became someone who posed no threat, and this perception allowed her to remain outside the conflicts that defined the court. Her ability to navigate danger through inaction contrasted sharply with the experiences of other women connected to the king. Many who attempted to secure their place within the palace faced scrutiny, resentment, and eventual downfall. Their efforts to influence the king or reshape the court, often served as the foundation for accusations. Elizabeth's refusal to engage in these pursuits provided her with a stability that eluded others. She understood that survival depended not on gaining power, but on avoiding situations where power became a trap. Even after leaving the court, she maintained a level of discretion that preserved her reputation. She married quietly, lived without attracting attention, and remained removed from the political turbulence that shaped the later years of Henry's reign. Her life unfolded with a steadiness uncommon among those who had once been connected to the king. People rarely spoke of her with hostility or suspicion. Her story lacked the dramatic conflicts that defined the experiences of queens and rivals. Yet this lack of distinction became the source of her safety. Her ability to withdraw demonstrated an awareness that many within the palace lacked. She saw that the court rewarded those who blended into the background, rather than those who attempted to shape events. She recognized that silence could provide more security than titles, and that absence could protect more effectively than influence. Her choices reflected a careful understanding of the court's instability, and her decisions allowed her to remain untouched by the destruction that consumed others. Elizabeth's life revealed the possibility of surviving the orbit of the king without becoming a casualty of it. Her restraint, her quiet demeanor, and her refusal to participate in the competition for favor showed a different path. One where safety came not from strength, but from the deliberate decision to avoid the game entirely. In a world dominated by ambition, her lack of ambition became her greatest advantage. Her quiet withdrawal revealed how survival sometimes depended on resisting the urge to pursue influence. The stillness surrounding her choices carried a clarity that contrasted sharply with the court's turmoil. As that calm expanded through the palace, another presence prepared to test the fragile order once again. Seating arrangements at Henry VIII's table revealed more than formal hierarchy. They exposed the shifting balance of influence in ways that quiet observers understood instantly. Each placement carried implications that extended beyond the meal itself. People noticed who sat close to the king, who remained at the margins, and who found their position altered without explanation. A movement of only a few centimeters could suggest rising favor or impending decline. The atmosphere around these meals remained calm on the surface, yet every participant felt the underlying tension that shaped their behavior. Those who sat nearest the king often approached the table with measured confidence. They understood that proximity offered opportunities to speak, to advise, or simply to be seen in a position that suggested trust. Yet this closeness created risk. Every gesture, comment, and expression could be interpreted by those watching. A single misplaced remark, even if spoken lightly, we had the potential to alter the king's mood or become material for whispers that spread through the palace. People seated near the king learned to weigh their words carefully, aware that attention could shift suddenly. The further one sat from the king, the more uncertain the position appeared. Distance suggested reduced influence or a temporary loss of favor. People in these seats attempted to maintain composure, avoiding any sign of discomfort that might confirm speculation. They monitored the tone of conversation, responding when necessary, but avoiding contributions that might reveal insecurity. They aimed to remain present without drawing notice, hoping that future meals would restore their former placement. Even slight changes in the seating plan created long conversations among courtiers after the meal ended. Those responsible for arranging the table understood the significance of their task. They followed the king's preferences precisely, placing each individual in a location that reflected not just rank but current standing. Their decisions, executed with quiet efficiency, shaped the perception of everyone at the table. Servants moved with a steady, unobtrusive rhythm, ensuring that nothing disrupted the formal flow. Yet they, too, understood the shifts occurring around them. The table offered a landscape where power could be read like a map, and servants became silent witnesses to its changes. During the meal, courtiers watched interactions with careful attention. They noted who received the king's questions, who earned glances of interest, and who encountered dismissive silence. The tone of the king's responses provided clues that guided future decisions. People studied these details not out of curiosity, but out of necessity. The court demanded constant awareness. Ignoring such signals meant falling behind those who adapted quickly. The table became a silent forum, where judgments formed long before official decisions were announced. Or more, often treated as harmless in other settings, carried particular danger here. A joke directed at the wrong person or delivered at the wrong moment could create offense. People spoke cautiously, calibrating their tone to avoid provoking displeasure. They understood that the king's reactions shifted unpredictably. Laughter one day could transform into irritation the next. No one wished to be associated with a remark that disrupted the balance of the meal. The table demanded not entertainment but restraint. Women in the court observed these dynamics with the same level of precision. Their seating reflected not just status, but the degree to which they were perceived as aligned with the king's expectations. They knew that a slight movement closer or further could hint at favor or suspicion. Conversations among them remained controlled, measured by the awareness that a misplaced word could travel beyond their intentions. Each meal reinforced their understanding of how fragile their stability was. The tension surrounding the table extended beyond conversation. People watched how food was served, how cups were filled, and how long it took for requests to be answered. Delays might suggest internal changes within the household staff. Excessive attention might indicate preparation for shifts in favor. Even the pace of the king's eating could influence how others behaved. The table required constant observation because everything within its boundaries served as a signal of something larger. For those hoping to rise, the seating arrangement provided opportunities. Being moved slightly closer to the king created openings for subtle influence. They could present themselves as attentive, loyal, and useful without needing to speak directly. Their presence became a silent demonstration of the king's approval. Yet, this opportunity carried equal danger. Increased visibility meant increased scrutiny. A single error could undo progress made over months. The climb toward favor occurred slowly, while the fall from it happened in an instant. People who held long-term positions near the king learned to limit their ambitions. They maintained stability by avoiding bold displays of confidence. Their goal was not to advance, but to endure. They understood that attempting to expand their influence risked drawing the attention of rivals. They positioned themselves as dependable figures who did not threaten others. This strategy allowed them to remain near the king without provoking the hostility that consumed those who pushed too aggressively. Meals in the court, therefore, functioned not as moments of relaxation, but as carefully managed events where silence became a form of protection. People consumed their food while monitoring every movement around them. The calm atmosphere concealed the pressure that guided their decisions. Each meal reinforced the understanding that power in this court moved through quiet signs rather than loud declarations. Tables, chairs, and distance became instruments of communication more effective than spoken words. The structure of these meals revealed how deeply the court relied on subtlety. People learned to interpret signals that others outside the palace might overlook. The arrangement of bodies around a table became a reflection of the kingdom's internal order. Those who recognized this survived longer than those who considered meals simple rituals. In Henry's court, even the act of sitting carried consequences. These shifting placements revealed how authority moved quietly through the smallest details of daily life. The stillness surrounding each meal carried an unease that deepened with every silent adjustment. As that tension settled into the palace, another presence prepared to disturb its delicate balance once again. Silence became one of the most reliable forms of protection in Henry VIII's court. A shield that required no display, yet carried unmistakable strength. People who understood the environment learned that restraint offered more security than intelligence. Charm, or confidence. They moved through the palace with controlled gestures, speaking only when necessary, and choosing each word with the awareness that it might later be repeated, altered, or weaponized. Their survival depended not on influence, but on the ability to avoid becoming a subject of conversation. Those who practiced this restraint recognized how quickly attention could shift. A casual remark could travel through corridors, reaching individuals who interpreted it with suspicion. Even harmless observations could be reframed into signs of dissent. People who wished to endure learned to monitor their tone, their expression, and the pace of their responses. They aimed to reveal nothing that might be misread. The court, shaped by unpredictability, rewarded those who remained unnoticed rather than those who sought to contribute. Individuals who showed loud enthusiasm or strong opinions often found themselves vulnerable. Their words carried edges that others could bend into accusations. The court favored those who allowed silence to speak for them, avoiding commitments that tied them to any side of a dispute. People discovered that stepping back created fewer openings for rivals to target them. The less they revealed, the less others could distort. Their neutrality offered a stillness that shielded them from the storm that consumed many who believed they could shape the king's attention. Those who survived longest perfected the art of deferred response. They answered questions with caution, avoiding details that extended beyond basic requirements. Their restraint gave them a reputation for reliability. Yet this reliability masked the deeper purpose of self-preservation. People trusted them because they offered no surprises. Their predictability made them appear safe, and safety in the court translated into stability. They understood that confidence expressed through silence often weighed more than confidence expressed through speech. The risk of speaking too openly increased whenever tensions rose within the palace. Political uncertainty, religious conflict, or shifts in favor heightened the danger surrounding even the simplest discussions. People who once spoke comfortably adjusted their behavior, reducing their presence and limiting their contributions. They recognized that silence offered flexibility. Without explicit statements tying them to particular views, they could adapt to changes without appearing inconsistent. This adaptability became a subtle form of resilience. Some individuals used silence as a means of observing. They watched how the king reacted to others, noting which gestures pleased him and which irritated him. They recognized the signs of shifting moods that shaped decisions. Their quiet approach allowed them to collect information without participating in the exchanges that often created risk. This observational distance positioned them advantageously, allowing them to make decisions when necessary without incurring the burden of public involvement. Those who ignored the value of silence often faced consequences. A misplaced comment could be interpreted as criticism. A joke delivered at the wrong time could be framed as insolence. A strong opinion could become evidence of opposition. The court did not require the speaker to intend harm. It required only the opportunity to reinterpret their words. People learned that the line between expression and accusation was narrow. Those who crossed it unintentionally discovered how quickly they could become isolated. Some of the loudest voices met the harshest ends. Their confidence in their ability to shape the court blinded them to the hazards surrounding them. They spoke with certainty, believing their position secure. Yet certainty offered no protection when whispers formed behind closed doors. The king reacted not to intent but to suggestion, and those suggestions often highlighted the dangers of outspoken behavior. Many who believed they had a firm footing found themselves removed without warning, punished not for action but for visibility. Quiet loyalty became one of the most sought-after qualities in those who served near the king. Advisors learned that obedience expressed without elaboration pleased him more than detailed explanations. Servants discovered that performing their duties without comment reduced the chance of misinterpretation. Courtiers recognized that aligning themselves with the king required minimal expression, not extensive displays of commitment. Silence did not weaken loyalty, it preserved it. Women in the court adapted to this environment with particular care. Their speech carried risk simply because others scrutinized it. They learned to minimize conversation, avoid engaging in disputes, and maintain composure during gatherings. Their silence did not indicate submission, but an understanding of how easily their words could be shaped against them. This restraint offered them a measure of security in a setting that seldom granted it. The court functioned as a place where the absence of words often carried more meaning than speech. People interpreted silence based on context, yet they preferred it to the volatility of open conversation. A quiet nod or lowered gaze could indicate agreement without requiring explanation. These subtle gestures allowed individuals to navigate complex situations without exposing themselves to accusation. Silence provided flexibility, whereas speech locked people into positions that could become dangerous. People who maintained this restraint developed a specific rhythm in their movements and interactions. They approached the king with calm deference, responded to inquiries with precision, and avoided expanding conversations beyond what was necessary. They learned to assess situations quickly, identifying moments when silence offered the safest path. Their survival did not depend on strategic brilliance, but on the consistent practice of caution. The court rewarded their discipline by allowing them to remain, year after year, as others rose and fell around them. Their lack of ambition shielded them from jealousy. Their lack of personal declarations protected them from suspicion. Their neutrality kept them far from the conflicts that ensnared those who believed influence guaranteed protection. Silence earned them the longevity that louder voices could not secure. This quiet discipline revealed how survival depended on withholding more than expressing. The atmosphere surrounding those who practiced such restraint grew heavier as the court shifted around them. During that steady stillness, another force prepared to unsettle those who thought caution alone would be enough. Henry VIII's will became the final structure he attempted to impose on a court he could no longer control. The document, written through layers of revisions, reflected not only his decisions, but also the influence of those who surrounded him during the last years of his life. Each clause carried implications that extended far beyond inheritance. Those who studied the text understood that every line altered the direction of authority, determining who would stand near the center of power and who would be forced to the margins. The uncertainty surrounding the king's intentions created an environment where interpretation became a weapon. The question of who would guide the kingdom during Edward VI's minority remained the most sensitive issue. The king had no surviving adult sons besides Edward, and the young heir lacked both experience and allies of his own. The will attempted to distribute authority among several trusted figures, forming a council designed to prevent any one individual from gaining dominance. Yet those who examined the arrangement saw the potential for instability. Equal authority rarely resulted in equal influence. Personal conflicts, long-standing resentments, and quiet ambitions shaped the interactions of the men named in the document. Those who believed they had earned a role in the regency waited anxiously for confirmation. Some were expected to be included due to years of service. Others hoped the king's late affection or convenience would secure their position. The will, however, did not reflect loyalty in simple terms. It revealed the degree to which proximity to the king during his declining health allowed certain individuals to shape his final decisions. Those who visited him frequently gained opportunities to influence revisions, while those who remained distant lost ground without realizing it. The presence of the Seymour family added tension to the interpretation of the will. Edward Seymour, the king's brother-in-law, emerged as a significant figure due to his connection to Jane Seymour and the birth of the male heir. His family's relationship to the young king gave them an advantage that others could not easily counter. Even before the king's death, people recognized the growing influence surrounding Edward Seymour. Those who read the will anticipated the possibility that the council's structure might shift rapidly. Regardless of what the document intended, the nobility understood that the will could become a foundation or a battlefield, depending on how it was received. Some saw it as a stabilizing framework during a vulnerable transition. Others saw it as an obstacle that required removal for the sake of personal advancement. The document contained both clarity and ambiguity, ensuring that no one could fully predict how events would unfold. This uncertainty became the source of private discussions, whispered arguments, and cautious alliances formed behind closed doors. Certain passages generated immediate debate. The instructions regarding the distribution of titles, lands, and responsibilities revealed subtle hierarchies that differed from public expectations. People who believed they had secured favor discovered they were granted less authority than anticipated. Others who had expected minimal inclusion found their names placed in positions of influence. This reshuffling of expectations created tensions that extended into the interactions of the council members themselves. The court, already accustomed to rapid shifts of fortune, reacted to the will with hesitancy. People examined the wording carefully, looking for signs of manipulation. The possibility that additions had been inserted without the king's full awareness circulated among those who sought to weaken the authority of their rivals. Though no one could verify the validity of such claims, the rumors offered a convenient justification for challenging decisions they found inconvenient. The uncertainty surrounding the document's authenticity became a tool in the hands of those who understood the value of doubt. As preparations for the king's funeral began, attention shifted toward the question of immediate power. The council, named in the will, represented the structure intended to guide the kingdom. Yet the men involved already understood that cooperation would be fragile. Their ambitions did not align, and their loyalty to one another had never been tested. Some saw the council as a temporary obstruction to their personal objectives. Others viewed it as a constraint that limited their influence. These differences shaped the conversations that occurred in private chambers, where voices remained low, and expressions concealed their deeper intentions. In the days immediately following Henry VIII's death, the council met to interpret its authority. Their discussions revealed the fractures already forming within the group. Some members argued for strict adherence to the king's written instructions. Others insisted that circumstances required flexibility. The absence of a strong central figure allowed individuals to assert interpretations that aligned with their ambitions. Their disagreements did not erupt openly. Yet the shifting tones and carefully chosen words signaled the emergence of new rivalries. Edward Seymour's rise unfolded quietly but steadily. His familial connection to the young king gave him leverage that the other council members could not counter directly. Without needing to challenge the document openly, he positioned himself as the natural protector of the heir. The others recognized the authority this created. Yet they lacked a unified strategy to resist. Their hesitation allowed Seymour to consolidate influence, gradually reducing the will's intended balance and reshaping the distribution of power in his favor. The kingdom entered a transition where the will served more as a symbol than a guiding framework. People cited its contents when convenient and questioned its validity when it conflicted with their agendas. This selective adherence created instability that extended throughout the court. Those who depended on the clarity of the king's decisions struggled to navigate the shifting interpretations. Those who benefited from ambiguity adapted easily, using the uncertainty to advance their own position. The will, intended as Henry VIII's final command, instead revealed the limits of his control. The men charged with executing his decisions reshaped them according to their ambitions. The document remained unchanged, yet its meaning evolved continuously. People recognized that its interpretation mattered more than its content. This understanding spread quietly through the palace, influencing the atmosphere in every chamber where discussions took place. The political environment surrounding the young king reflected the volatility that the will had unleashed. Each decision, public announcement, or shift in authority traced back to the document's ambiguous structure. Those who observed these changes sensed the emerging pattern. Stability depended not on the clarity of Henry VIII's final commands, but on the willingness of the council members to uphold them. Their reluctance ensured that conflict remained embedded in the transition. This fragile arrangement revealed how authority fractured the moment the king's voice disappeared. Quiet maneuvers began spreading across the council, each attempt to claim influence, pushing the balance into sharper tension. A new figure stood at the edge of these calculations, ready to draw every faction toward a hope they feared as much as they desired. Mary entered the shifting power structure at a moment when clarity had already vanished from the court. Her presence carried the weight of lineage, and that alone turned her into a point of tension for every faction seeking direction after the king's death. Those who approached her did so with calculated politeness, speaking softly and measuring every gesture, because supporting her or rejecting her could expose them to danger from rival groups. Nothing about her daily movements suggested confidence. Yet each step she took across the palace corridors attracted silent scrutiny from people, assessing whether she could become a rallying point. She had grown up under the shadow of decisions that had reshaped the kingdom's religious identity, and that past followed her into every conversation. Some individuals viewed her as a symbol capable of restoring the old order, while others feared she might undo their carefully secured positions. This uncertainty made her valuable to many and threatening to even more. Her appearance at gatherings often caused people to step back slightly, creating small, cautious gaps as they attempted to read her expression for signs of intent. Even a brief pause in her voice could cause whispered speculation among those monitoring her closely. The council members responsible for guiding the realm after the king's death studied her behavior in private meetings. They kept their discussions measured, avoiding explicit statements that might be interpreted as taking a side. Her religious identity, widely known and deeply rooted, made her a central figure in arguments about stability. Each faction tested the possibility of aligning with her, yet none committed openly. The risk of misjudgment was too high. Her mere existence forced them to examine loyalties they claimed to hold, but rarely practiced when circumstances turned dangerous. Mary's personal attendants noticed how often she appeared withdrawn, not from pride, but from an awareness of her precarious position. Every gesture she made, every word she used when addressing servants, could be interpreted as a sign of alignment with someone. Even silence carried meaning, and she understood that any misstep could place supporters in jeopardy. Her relationship with the household staff became another source of tension, as they too risked being seen as conduits for influence. People learned to speak to her briefly, avoiding any tone that suggested familiarity. Outside her chambers, political groups measured her potential influence by observing who visited her, who avoided her, and who attempted to block access. Some individuals made a show of distancing themselves, hoping to signal loyalty to the current council's direction. Others approached with quiet assurances, promising support while never committing anything in writing. These private meetings were conducted behind closed doors, yet rumors spread effortlessly, reaching corners of the court where interpretation mattered more than truth. Mary's position grew more unstable when international observers reacted to her presence. Envoys from Catholic territories viewed her as a future link to their interests, while officials tied to reformist factions saw danger in allowing her influence to grow unchecked. Their reports circulated among the elite, amplifying the fear that her rise could shift diplomatic alignments. Even those who did not favor her understood that ignoring her was impossible. The question was not whether she would shape events, but how far people were willing to go to use her image for their own goals. Her days were marked by careful routines, yet she never appeared fully settled. She walked the palace corridors with deliberate stillness, as if aware that every turn of her head might invite interpretation. Observers claim she avoided unnecessary statements and held a steady expression even when courtiers probed her opinions. This restraint unnerved many, because unpredictability in someone so symbolically important created vulnerability for everyone who underestimated her resolve. The court's women, particularly those who had served under multiple queens, recognized a familiar pattern in Mary's treatment. They saw how quickly a single misinterpreted gesture could become a tool for rivals. Some offered her quiet support, though they did so discreetly, aware that open friendliness might place them in conflict with stronger factions. Mary responded with polite gratitude yet remained measured, understanding the limited protection such relationships could offer. The tension surrounding her reached dining halls, chapels, and council chambers, Any space where she appeared became charged with speculation. Courtiers lowered their voices when she passed, adjusting their expressions to avoid being associated too clearly with either approval or disapproval. She did not need to speak for her presence to influence decisions. Her identity alone reshaped the political landscape, even if she never intended it. Despite the instability, Mary learned how to maneuver through the shifting alliances. She kept conversations brief, avoided bold declarations, and allowed others to reveal their ambitions first. This approach convinced some people that she was inexperienced, but others recognized it as a form of survival. Her restraint acted as a shield, preventing factions from easily categorizing her. She walked a narrow path, neither offering too much hope nor rejecting those who approached her with caution. Her position remained precarious, balanced between admiration, fear, and utility. Every faction tried to measure how much influence she might wield without triggering a reaction that could threaten them. Her fate depended not only on her own choices, but on the calculations of people who saw her as either a tool or an obstacle. The quiet movements around her revealed how fragile power became when attached to someone who had not yet spoken fully. Her presence showed how symbols could unsettle the court without demanding attention. Movements surrounding her revealed struggles stretching further than titles or positions. Deeper conflict gathered quietly, guided by those who understood that silence could redirect entire reigns. The individuals who endured the shifting storms of Henry's court rarely appeared in the foreground of its major conflicts. They moved along the edges of corridors, attended gatherings without attracting eyes, and managed their duties with an unremarkable steadiness that gave others little to discuss. Their survival depended on allowing louder voices to collide, while they maintained a distance that felt neither indifferent nor engaged. These quiet figures learned that remaining unmemorable was more effective than any declaration of loyalty. Their faces seldom appeared in the accounts of significant decisions, yet their presence filled the background of nearly every moment. They observed without staring, and listened without reacting, gathering details others revealed when they thought no one was paying attention. This restraint allowed them to understand the unspoken rules of the court more effectively than those who competed openly. People who shouted their allegiances or boasted of access to the king constantly placed themselves at risk. Those who stayed unnoticed avoided the dangerous currents that swallowed the ambitious. These survivors understood that proximity to the king rarely ensured safety. They maintained functional relationships rather than intimate ones, never allowing any single faction to claim them. Their words remained measured, precisely chosen to avoid being interpreted as criticism or endorsement. When asked about matters that touched sensitive alliances, they offered polite answers that revealed nothing. Their strength came from an absence of vulnerability that made it difficult for opponents to weaponize their actions. During moments of heightened tension, they blended into the routines of the palace. While others argued or attempted to showcase their loyalty, the quiet ones assisted with administrative tasks, checked inventories, or delivered documents without comment. Their reliability provided stability that louder courtiers often lacked. People recognized their competence, but rarely focused on it, allowing them to remain essential without becoming visible enough to draw suspicion. Their living quarters reflected this understated existence. They kept modest rooms, neither overly decorated nor aggressively plain. The objects on their shelves tended to be gifts from relatives rather than tokens from powerful patrons. This absence of symbols prevented rivals from interpreting their possessions as signs of affiliation. Even their clothing signaled neutrality. Well kept but simple, designed to meet court expectations without suggesting any desire to rise above their position. Servants, guards, and minor officials recognized the pattern. The ones who outlasted multiple reigns were seldom the individuals who sought recognition. They adapted quietly to each shift in policy, adjusting their tasks to suit new expectations, without expressing opinions that could be repeated or misinterpreted. When reforms arrived, they complied. When reversals followed, they complied again. Their consistency created a form of protection that louder courtiers could not replicate. These people rarely engaged in the subtle gossip that shaped alliances. They listened long enough to understand the atmosphere of danger, but avoided participating in conversations that could implicate them. Others sometimes interpreted their silence as shyness or disinterest. In reality, it was a deliberate strategy, refined through years of witnessing ambitious individuals destroyed by misplaced confidence in their influence. Their presence during meals mirrored their broader behavior. They sat at unremarkable positions, neither near the king nor pushed to the fringes. Their voices remained low, their laughter quiet, their reactions contained. Even when jesters or noblemen made provocative remarks, they responded with polite nods rather than joining the exchange. By refusing to display strong emotion, they denied others opportunities to draw them into disputes. The survivors recognized that vengeance and resentment thrived among those who felt overlooked or wronged. They avoided creating either. No one considered them enemies because they lacked characteristics that inspired envy. They did not flaunt accomplishments or offer unsolicited advice. They performed tasks well enough to remain valuable, but never so impressively that powerful courtiers feared competition. Their existence depended on this precise balance. When dramatic events shook the court, executions, sudden accusations, and rapid policy shifts, these quiet figures continued to fulfill their duties. Their reactions remained controlled, neither too shocked nor too detached. People seeking alliances often passed them by, assuming that someone so calm must lack ambition. Yet that absence of ambition was the very thing that preserved them through dangerous cycles of loyalty and betrayal. Their survival did not mean the absence of awareness. They watched with careful attention, noting which noble families gained ground and which fell into disfavor. They tracked changes in the king's temperament and the mutations of his trust. Their caution allowed them to navigate transitions that destroyed others. They lived through multiple phases of the reign without ever becoming central to its struggles, and this distance kept them safe. In hallways, they walked with steady gestures that conveyed neither hesitation nor eagerness. Courtiers approached them for minor tasks, but no one expected them to influence decisions. Their neutrality became their shield, and their invisibility became their greatest strength. While others competed for recognition, they survived by ensuring no one felt threatened by their presence. Their existence proved that stability inside Henry's court required something quieter than ambition. They demonstrated how endurance belonged to those who understood the limits of visibility and the risks attached to every spoken word. Their restraint became the lesson that louder individuals failed to learn until consequences fell heavily upon them. These figures revealed that endurance often came from resisting the impulse to seek notice. Their quiet paths through the palace shaped an understanding of survival that outlasted the ambitions of louder courtiers. The muted movements they left behind prepared the ground for another fall, one carried by a man who once believed silence could protect him. Cromwell's rise had been built on precision, adaptability, and an unbroken instinct for reading the king's intentions before others sensed them. His ability to reshape institutions and redirect the flow of power made him indispensable during the years when Henry sought control over both throne and church. He moved with purpose through the corridors of authority, leaving behind decisions that restructured the kingdom in ways no one had anticipated. Yet the strength that carried him upward contained the same fragility that would one day leave him exposed. Those who observed his ascent often noted how rarely he hesitated. He spoke with clarity in council meetings, proposed solutions when others feared to speak, and executed the king's commands with a confidence that suggested complete understanding. But confidence in that court was double-edged. Each successful maneuver created resentment among nobles, who believed reform had stripped them of power. Every administrative victory deepened the suspicion that he had grown too comfortable shaping the realm according to his own calculations. When Henry demanded an alliance through marriage, Cromwell approached the task with the same focus he applied to political matters. He arranged the match, believing it would strengthen England's position and secure the king's trust. Yet the moment Henry met the chosen bride, Dissatisfaction spread through the palace like a sudden chill. The king's displeasure, quiet at first, took shape in narrowed glances and abrupt shifts in tone that Cromwell recognized too late. A single misjudgment, one poorly received union, became the fracture that widened beneath his feet. People who had once bowed their heads when he passed began withholding greetings. Conversations that previously halted at his approach now continued without pause. The subtle withdrawal of courtesy revealed how quickly alliances dissolved when the king's affection shifted. Cromwell moved through the hallways with the same deliberate pace as before, but the atmosphere around him changed. Those who had benefited from his reforms stepped back to protect themselves, and those who hated his influence saw opportunity in the king's dissatisfaction. During council sessions, he spoke less frequently. His voice, once firm, carried traces of caution as he navigated questions whose answers could be twisted into accusations. He sensed that observers waited for any sign of weakness, ready to interpret hesitation as guilt. Yet he continued to fulfill his responsibilities, hoping that the king's frustration would fade with time. That hope grew thinner each day as the court aligned itself against him with increasing confidence. When the arrest came, it arrived without warning. Guards approached with steady steps, delivering the order without raising their voices. Cromwell offered no resistance, understanding that struggle would only hasten the perception of guilt. His silence during the arrest did not come from acceptance but from recognition that words had lost their protective power. Everything he had built, institutions, alliances, reforms, could not shield him from a king who felt betrayed by a single disappointment. Inside his cell, he waited while rumors spread through the court with unsettling speed. People who had once sought his favor now repeated stories designed to justify their abandonment. They described him as manipulative, overly ambitious, and dangerous to the stability of the state. Each accusation reflected long-held resentment finally allowed to surface. His absence from the palace created a space others rushed to fill, competing to prove loyalty by distancing themselves from him. Cromwell's attempts at explanation never reached the ears they needed to reach. Requests for an audience remained unanswered. His letters, if delivered at all, received no reply. The silence he had once used as a tool for negotiation became an unyielding barrier that separated him from every opportunity to defend himself. People avoided mentioning his name during meals, concerned that any association might place them under scrutiny. His existence had shifted from central authority to forgotten presence in a matter of days. As the execution date approached, he maintained the calm demeanor that had carried him through years of political turmoil. Witnesses noted that he did not lash out or plead, nor did he accuse those who had abandoned him. His silence, however, no longer communicated strength. It revealed the final limitation of his skill, understanding the king's desires but failing to recover once the king decided to withdraw trust. In Henry's world, loss of favor was permanent. The court treated his downfall as confirmation that no individual, regardless of talent, could rise above the king's changing expectations. People resumed their duties with cautious vigilance, absorbing the lesson his end had demonstrated. No one spoke openly about the reforms he created or the stability he had provided. The void, his absence left behind, filled quickly with new ambitions and new fears. Cromwell's execution marked not only the end of his influence, but also a warning that echoed throughout the palace. His rise had been unprecedented, and his fall equally so. Those who survived understood the pattern. Visibility carried danger, and misjudgment, no matter how small, could erase years of service. Cromwell's final moments proved that silence, once his weapon, offered no protection when the king's disappointment hardened into decree. His fall revealed how swiftly influence collapsed when trust dissolved. The tension that followed his absence settled uneasily across the court, shaping new calculations among those still standing. From that shifting ground emerged another struggle. this time centered on children whose futures were mapped by hands far more ambitious than their own. The royal children lived inside rooms designed to feel safe. Yet every detail surrounding them reflected decisions made by adults seeking influence. Their tutors, attendants, and guardians were selected not for gentle temperament, but for the political value they carried. Each appointment signaled a shift in the balance of power, and every lesson taught to the young heirs served as a message aimed at the factions waiting outside their chambers. Even the books placed on their desks carried expectations shaped by interests far beyond their understanding. Their days followed a careful rhythm: morning studies, modest meals, restricted recreation, all overseen by individuals who measured every word spoken in the children's presence. These caretakers knew that any display of preference could be interpreted as political alignment. The children, still learning how to interpret adult behavior, sensed the tension around them, even if they could not articulate it. They watched the way servants adjusted their expressions in front of different visitors, noting how silence replaced conversation when specific names were mentioned. Each child represented a potential future, and that alone made them dangerous to people who favored competing claims. Mary's legitimacy, Elizabeth's shifting status, and Edward's position as male heir created intersecting loyalties that extended into every corner of the palace. Visitors arrived under the pretense of formality, yet their glances revealed deeper intentions as they tried to gauge how each child might one day react to political landscapes still forming beyond the palace walls. Those charged with shaping the children's minds practiced great caution. A single comment about faith, duty, or authority could influence how the children perceived their roles within the realm. Because of this risk, lessons were delivered in neutral tones, avoiding subjects that might implicate the tutors in arguments they could not defend. The children sensed this restraint and learned quickly that asking questions led to tight smiles or quiet diversions to safer topics. Such avoidance taught them obedience long before they understood its purpose. During meals, the children sat with composed posture, observing the concealed hierarchy displayed through the behavior of adults who served or supervised them. Their awareness grew slowly, fed by the realization that minor shifts in tone indicated approval or displeasure. They learned when to remain silent and when to mirror the expectations imposed upon them. Speaking unnecessarily invited scrutiny, and scrutiny invited interpretation that could reach the ears of counselors eager for opportunities to shape opinions about potential heirs. They seldom played freely. Recreation took place under the watchful eyes of attendants instructed to record behaviors that might reveal a child's temperament. These observations circulated among officials who sought advantages in predicting future alliances. A moment of stubbornness, a rare display of enthusiasm, or a quiet withdrawal could be discussed privately by people preparing for political changes. The children never knew how heavily their smallest gestures weighed upon those crafting strategies around them. Visitors of high rank approached the children with carefully moderated warmth. They avoided over-familiarity to prevent accusations of manipulation, yet expressed enough politeness to remain on favorable terms should the child ascend in the future. These interactions carried a stillness that children instinctively recognized. Their responses became measured over time, shaped by an awareness that affection offered too freely could place them at the center of conflicts they barely understood. The royal children's chambers became neutral zones within the palace, spaces where silence acted as a protective barrier. They learned to speak less than they wished, lowering their voices when guards passed or when attendants exchanged glances near the doorway. This habit of restraint formed not from fear of punishment, but from a sense that the adults around them listened too intently. They sensed how spoken words softened the invisible shield that guarded them, and they tightened that shield by withholding what others might use. Their education emphasized obedience, self-control, and awareness. Lessons about scripture and governance are intertwined with reminders to observe decorum. These children grew up understanding that survival depended not only on following rules but also on recognizing the shifting nature of expectations. They adapted without complaint, demonstrating maturity that seemed unnatural for their age. Their calm expressions concealed the pressure of living under constant supervision. Even moments of vulnerability were monitored. Illnesses brought physicians tied to political interests, each reporting conditions that could influence broader decisions. A fever or prolonged fatigue could trigger discussions about succession. Those taking notes during examinations did so not only to ensure the child's health, but also to inform groups planning for long-term influence. The royal children existed in bodies too small for the burdens placed upon them. Their silence became their protection. They spoke cautiously, with deliberate spacing between words, and learned early that a neutral expression could prevent misinterpretation. Their restraint did not guarantee safety, but it prevented immediate exploitation. Observers who sought insight into their thoughts grew frustrated with their composure, unaware that the children had been trained to protect themselves long before they understood the stakes of their lives. Their survival into adulthood depended on the lessons absorbed during these quiet years. They learned that power did not belong solely to those with titles. It drifted among those who controlled access, shaped narratives, and decided which version of truth would be repeated. The children grew up aware of the distance between appearance and intention, never fully trusting the praise offered by adults who shifted loyalties without hesitation. Their upbringing revealed how futures could be engineered through careful control rather than open guidance. The restrained world surrounding them shaped heirs who understood danger long before they experienced authority. From this upbringing emerged a final struggle, centered on a man whose fall exposed the limits of silence, when ambition collided with suspicion. Silence that settled over Henry's court in the final years of his reign did not emerge suddenly. It formed slowly, shaped by countless moments in which individuals realized that speaking carried consequences no one could fully predict. The courtiers who had once filled the palace with strategic conversations and competing claims learned to lower their voices, adjust their expressions, and conceal their intentions for the sake of survival. Quiet movements replaced bold declarations, and measured restraint became the only reliable shield in a world ruled not by trust but by fear. Those who had witnessed multiple rises and falls understood that the king's authority did not depend on constant displays of force. His presence alone, shifting between moments of charm and sudden anger, produced enough uncertainty to silence the court. People anticipated his reactions before he entered a room, adjusting their postures and controlling their breathing. This anticipation became a kind of discipline, one that required them to remain constantly aware of the distance between themselves and danger. In this atmosphere, individuals learned that choices made in whispers held greater power than anything spoken aloud. Agreements formed behind closed doors, conveyed through carefully chosen words that left no trace of commitment. A single, misinterpreted gesture could unravel alliances built over years. People watched not only for threats, but for the subtle changes in tone that indicated shifting loyalties. They measured each other's reactions the way soldiers studied enemy positions. Yet they did so quietly, avoiding any outward sign that might draw attention. Execution notices arrived without fanfare, often preceded by abrupt absences that courtiers pretended not to notice. The corridors through which powerful figures once walked with confidence grew still after their disappearance. Servants moved with greater caution during these periods, sensing tension thickening around the palace as people recalculated their positions. No one openly acknowledged fear, but it was present in every slowed conversation, and every glance exchanged between those wondering who might vanish next. Even moments of celebration carried an undertone of unease. Feasts and ceremonies continued, but the energy that once accompanied them faded under the weight of unspoken caution. People laughed softly, careful not to appear too comfortable. They praised one another with words that revealed little. Those who attempted to command attention risked exposing themselves to scrutiny, and scrutiny often led to suspicion. The court grew accustomed to the idea that safety required reducing one's presence to something easily overlooked. Henry himself shifted between engagement and withdrawal, experiencing the isolation created partly by his own authority. He surrounded himself with attendants who interpreted his moods with meticulous care, adjusting their behavior to prevent triggering displeasure. Yet no matter how closely they observed him, they could not bridge the distance that came from being both ruler and man. His decisions carried consequences that extended far beyond the moment, shaping the lives of people who responded with fear rather than loyalty. His private chambers reflected this solitude. Advisors entered only when summoned and left as soon as their purpose was fulfilled. His meals grew quieter, marked by pauses that no one dared to fill. Conversations that once offered companionship diminished into procedural exchanges. People who had shared years of service with him learned to remain composed in his presence, avoiding familiarity that might be misinterpreted as disrespect. The air around him thickened with reverence and caution, leaving little room for genuine connection. Those who studied Henry from a distance recognized the weariness that shaped his later decisions. His authority remained intact, yet the cost of maintaining it had become evident. The rivals he eliminated, the confidants he replaced, and the families he reshaped through political necessity all contributed to a growing emptiness. The court adjusted to that emptiness by maintaining an emotional distance, reinforcing the barrier separating ruler from subjects. This division ensured that even in moments of vulnerability, he remained alone. The people who survived his reign understood the pattern that defined the court. Those who spoke boldly disappeared first, while those who learned to calculate the weight of each word endured. The survivors moved through the palace with a quiet confidence built on restraint. They learned to anticipate danger before it manifested, recognizing that silence did not merely conceal intent, it protected them from becoming visible targets. Their endurance reflected not strength but caution, a quality refined through years of witnessing missteps, punished without hesitation. Children born into the royal family absorbed this silence long before they understood its purpose. They watched their caretakers navigate conversations with precision, never offering commentary that could be interpreted as political alignment. The children learned early that observation was safer than expression, adopting habits that mirrored the adults around them. This training prepared them for futures in which authority rested heavily on their shoulders. Yet it also deprived them of the freedom to explore their own thoughts without fear. The court's stillness grew more pronounced each time a prominent figure fell. Cromwell's execution, Anne Boleyn's removal, and Wolsey's downfall each reinforced the idea that no one's position was secure. Even those who held privileged roles sensed instability beneath their feet. Every alliance contained potential danger, and every gesture risked misinterpretation. People practiced caution not because they lacked ambition, but because ambition had become indistinguishable from peril. As Henry's health declined, the silence surrounding him deepened. Courtiers debated succession in private, while presenting unwavering loyalty in his presence. They analyzed his expressions for signs of favor or displeasure, adjusting their behavior accordingly. Some attempted to remain essential to the evolving political structure, while others stepped back, hoping invisibility might shield them from the turmoil that awaited the realm after his death. These silent calculations shaped the final chapter of his reign. By the time the king approached his final days, the palace had become a place of controlled restraint. Conversations echoed faintly through the corridors, but none carried the force they once held. The court became a reflection of the man who ruled it, powerful, unpredictable, and profoundly alone. Those who stood near him understood that authority, for all its grandeur, created isolation that no servant or advisor could ease. Henry's legacy, shaped by both strength and fear, left a pattern that endured beyond his lifetime. The events of his reign demonstrated how silence could protect, manipulate, and destroy with equal precision. The individuals who lived through those years carried the memory of that silence with them, using it as guidance for navigating uncertainty in future regimes. Yet the memory also carried the weight of all who had disappeared without raising their voices, victims of a system that rewarded caution more consistently than loyalty. In the end, The court remained quiet. So quiet that the absence left by those who died echoed through its halls more sharply than any spoken accusation. Silence revealed the truth more clearly than words. It showed that the power binding the court together had been fear, not trust, and that those who survived did so by understanding when to step back, when to hold their breath, and when to disappear into the background. This final stillness revealed how fear governed every rise and fall throughout the reign. Echoes left behind by those who endured shaped an understanding of survival that outlasted the Tudor throne. Somewhere in that lingering quiet, Henry stood as the clearest reminder of how authority can produce isolation that no triumph can soften. Thank you for staying through these long shadows of Tudor history. Rest well, let your thoughts settle, and drift into calm. Good night.